Imagine if I shared with you that one of Scripture's most infamous peoples had its start through a shocking event inside a cavern, developed into the greatest adversary of Israel, and eventually encountered divine condemnation that reverberates across all time. From their scandalous beginnings involving the daughters of Lot, through their strategic attacks against the people of Israel, from the cursed plots of Balak, all the way to their ultimate prophetic destruction, we are about to explore every turn, every betrayal, and every moment of divine involvement in this sweeping biblical narrative spanning more than 10 centuries. Before we continue, though, if this is your first time on this channel, please think about tapping that like button and subscribing if you have not done so yet. Additionally, share with us your location and the current time where you are. We are creating a worldwide community right here. So, with no more delay, shall we get started? In those ancient territories where the sun descends behind rugged mountain peaks, a story unfolds that will resonate across millennia. A narrative that opens in shadow and disgrace, yet contains within itself the origins of peoples not yet born. The cavern now rests in silence, hollowed out from limestone formations rising above the harsh waters of the Dead Sea. Within this empty space, an event transpired that would determine the fate of entire populations across many generations. The atmosphere within still feels oppressive, as though the gravity of what happened in this place will not dissipate. The daughters of Lot gathered close in the faint light. Their entire world had collapsed. The urban centers they had known, the existence they had understood, the tomorrow they had anticipated, all consumed by flame and brimstone. What lay behind them was nothing but cinder and recollection. What stretched ahead was barren land and unknowns. They believed themselves to be the final survivors of their people. The elder daughter breaks the silence initially. Her voice carries the urgency of someone who perceives no future unless she manufactures it with her own hands. "Our father is aging," she murmurs. "No men remain anywhere on earth to unite with us in the manner that is common to all people." Her younger sister pays attention, dread intermingling with something else visible in her expression, a dreadful comprehension of what her sibling is suggesting. Wine is poured that evening. Perhaps ancient wine rescued from the destruction of Sodom, or possibly acquired from traveling traders. The specifics hold little importance. What holds significance is the decision being executed, the boundary being violated, the tomorrow being molded by trembling hands as they pour. 2 evenings unfold in this manner, 2 decisions reached in shadow, 2 sons brought into being through shame and despair. The cave, providing them refuge, transforms into a birthplace for peoples, though not peoples who would be favored. Peoples emerging from terror, from seizing what had not been offered, from pursuing existence through methods that contain mortality within themselves. The firstborn son takes his initial breath beneath celestial bodies that have observed kingdoms ascend and crumble. His mother calls him Moab, meaning from father, a designation that will perpetually remind him of his beginning. The second infant, Ben-Ami, will become the ancestor of the Ammonite people. However, our narrative traces the first child, the one whose very name embodies both relation and taint. From the instant of his arrival, Moab bears something unusual, beyond merely the mark of his conception. He bears the conflict between favor and condemnation that will characterize his offspring. His great-uncle Abraham had been granted assurances from the Almighty. His grandfather Lot had selected the irrigated lowlands. Now Moab receives an inheritance corrupted by desperation and dishonor. The infant develops strength in the wasteland. His vision learns to interpret the delicate indicators of moisture in arid locations. His limbs learn the routes connecting various settlements. His fingers learn to cultivate the unforgiving earth of the eastern plateaus. Yet something within his essence stays unsettled, as though he comprehends that he was created to be apart, to be different, to exist separate from the covenant lineage flowing through his far-off kin. When Moab matures into adulthood, he migrates toward the east, distancing himself from territories holding too many painful memories. The Jordan River transforms into more than a geographical division. On one bank lies the patrimony of Abraham's selected descendants. On the opposite side, Moab starts constructing something fresh, a people, a civilization, a population who will establish their identity partly through what they are not. The highlands, situated east of the Dead Sea, receive him. These are territories of crimson rock and unexpected tempests, where grain flourishes gold in concealed ravines and water sources emerge from profound depths within the ground. Here, throughout the slopes and elevated plains, the Moabite people learn to form a nation. They create their own dialect, their own traditions, their own method of comprehending the sacred. Yet perpetually the recollection of that cave persists, transmitted through hushed voices, through cautions, through the manner mothers regard their offspring when storms accumulate in the western sky. The Moabite people understand they are offspring of disgrace, and disgrace molds a population differently than blessing accomplishes. It renders them ravenous for dignity, frantic to demonstrate their value, swift to perceive offense where none was intended. Years flow past like changing seasons, and Moab the individual becomes Moab the legend. But his progeny bear his designation and his weight. They increase in number throughout the eastern territories, constructing urban centers on elevated ground and defensive structures in lowlands. They master the craft of working iron and bronze, of raising sheep and bovines, of conducting commerce with the traveling merchants who traverse their domain, transporting aromatic substances and valuable minerals. But perpetually exists the awareness that somewhere toward the west, across the Jordan, resides another extension of their ancestral line. The selected ones, the favored ones, those who bear divine assurances instead of humiliation. This awareness operates within the Moabite spirit like fermentation in dough, producing expansion but also producing acidity. Generations cascade like rainfall down mountainsides. The progeny of Moab forget numerous things: the precise language uttered in that cavern, the flavor of Sodom's fermented drink, the quality of their forefather's voice when he initially cried beneath unknown stars. However, they retain the fundamental reality. They are linked to the covenant population, yet perpetually divided from them. They are kin, yet adversaries. They are selected, yet condemned. This contradiction becomes the basis of everything that comes after. Every partnership, every conflict, every instant of tranquility or warfare between Moab and Abraham's children will echo backward to that cave, to those choices executed in darkness, to the emergence of a people from frantic affection and horrific necessity. The curse that initiated everything was not articulated by divine voice or inscribed on stone monuments. It was woven into the very essence of Moab's commencement. The curse of being created from family, yet perpetually alienated from family, of bearing favor in their ancestry, yet never possessing the ability to fully access it, of understanding their value, yet perpetually questioning whether others perceive only their humiliation. As the sun descends beyond the western peaks, projecting extended shadows throughout the Moabite highlands, the foundation is established for everything that will transpire. A population created from catastrophe, molded by division, fated to perform the intricate performance of kinship and competition with their covenant relatives across generations still to arrive. The cave becomes quiet once more, but the narrative it delivered into existence has only just commenced. The downfall of Lot. The journey to Moab commences in Sodom. The morning light ascends above Sodom's fortifications like optimism emerging from obscurity. But optimism has become unfamiliar in these pathways. The urban center awakens to another cycle of abundance, constructed on supports that fracture slightly deeper with each passing season. Few observe the subtle indications, the way juvenile laughter carries a forced quality, how traders' gazes shift anxiously between patron and doorway, the fashion in which prayers are murmured rather than proclaimed. Lot traverses these recognizable routes with the controlled rhythm of an individual who has discovered his position in society, yet never entirely persuaded himself he truly belongs within it. His residence stands impressive among the superior homes, its open courtyard resonating with the activities of material success, household workers preparing sustenance, youngsters engaged in amusement, the soft sounds of well-nourished livestock in adjacent enclosures. He has constructed something within this place, something meaningful and enduring. Or so it seems. The years spent in Sodom have been generous to Lot in the ways that hold greatest significance to those who calculate achievement through visible possessions. His livestock have multiplied beyond calculation. His domestic establishment commands regard at the city's assembly. His daughters have matured into beautiful and intelligent young women, pursued by young men from families of prominence. When he sits alongside the community leaders to receive disputes and pronounce verdicts, others pay attention with the respect afforded to an individual whose guidance carries influence. Yet something gnaws at the periphery of his satisfaction, like an unrelenting wind gradually eroding stone. Correspondence arrives occasionally from his uncle Abraham, transported by dust-covered travelers who speak of altars erected beneath open heavens and commitments received from the voice of the Almighty. These communications describe a different variety of material success, livestock that multiply through sacred favor rather than meticulous animal husbandry, protection that originates from sacred agreement rather than urban fortifications, prosperity that emerges from faithful obedience rather than seizing opportunity. Lot examines these letters in solitude, typically during the evening hours, when the domestic establishment transitions into rest. He considers each phrase, pursuing something he cannot identify. Abraham composes accounts of journeying with the divine presence, of dialogues that transform the inner being, of a tomorrow extending past the visible boundary like an uninterrupted commitment. The language awakens something profound in Lot's inner being, a yearning, possibly, or perhaps merely the reverberation of what existed previously. But daybreak perpetually arrives, and accompanying it the realistic requirements of existence in Sodom. Commercial partnerships demand focus. Social responsibilities must be fulfilled. The apparatus of urban material success demands continuous sustenance with effort and attention and deliberate accommodation. Gradually, incrementally, the awakening in his inner being becomes subdued until it transforms into scarcely more than background melody, barely detectable above the more prominent melodies of everyday existence. The accommodation commences modestly, as accommodation invariably does. A statement withheld when dialogue turns toward matters that trouble his essence. A behavior disregarded when confronting it might cost him authority or companionship. A principle relaxed when maintaining firmness might signify standing isolated. Each accommodation appears justified at the moment, rationalized by situations, or necessitated by practical wisdom. None of them, considered individually, seems meaningful enough to be consequential, but accommodation gathers like sediment in a waterway, gradually altering the channel until the current flows in directions never originally planned. Lot discovers himself agreeing with dialogues that would have appalled him in earlier years. He engages in customs his moral compass once refused. He forms partnerships with individuals whose principles align inadequately with the faith. Abraham instructed him beside campfires, beneath desert celestial bodies. His daughters observe their father navigate these circumstances with the penetrating perception of youth that observes everything but comprehends little. They absorb from his demonstration that faith is something concealed, something that bends rather than shatters, something that conforms to situations rather than transforming them. They internalize the teaching that fitting in holds greater importance than conviction, that material success validates divine approval more effectively than faithful obedience demonstrates divine affection. The urban center's influence penetrates into Lot's domestic establishment, like moisture, discovering fractures in a support structure. His household workers embrace the casual perspectives towards sacred matters they witness in their employer. His spouse starts to perceive the traditional ways as charming rather than purposeful, appropriate perhaps for desert wanderers, but scarcely realistic for urban, refined individuals. The very atmosphere they inhale seems saturated with the presumption that Sodom's approach is the advanced approach, the informed approach, the approach of individuals who have progressed beyond the straightforward certainties of an earlier period. Years transpire in this fashion, each one rendering the transformation appear more organic and less observable. Lot transforms into a sodomite who happens to recall Abraham, rather than Abraham's nephew who happens to reside in Sodom. The differentiation might seem delicate, but it bears within it the contrast between a temporary dwelling and a permanent character, between existing in the society and being of it. When divine emissaries arrive at Sodom's entrances, they discover Lot occupying the position of power and status he has labored so deliberately to accomplish. He identifies them instantly. Something regarding their demeanor, their countenances, the manner they conduct themselves, communicates the reality he once inhabited. His reaction is swift and automatic. He stands, bows profoundly, and urges them to receive his hospitality with the intensity of an individual who recognizes this may be his final connection to an existence he exchanged away, fragment by fragment. The meal he arranges for them that evening is spectacular by Sodom's measures, but it carries the flavor of powder in his throat. Throughout the table, the emissaries speak of condemnation approaching swift as summer electrical discharge. They employ language Lot has not encountered in years. Language regarding virtue and corruption, regarding divine tolerance reaching its boundary, regarding the unavoidable harvest that succeeds a season of cultivating wickedness. Beyond his entrance, the urban center exposes its authentic character in ways that can no longer be disregarded or rationalized away. The disturbances that ascend from the pathways that evening strip away every comfortable delusion Lot has erected regarding the location he selected to designate as home. The accommodation that appears so justified in sunlight reveals its true face in the obscurity, and that face is repulsive beyond articulation. Daybreak delivers emissaries of compassion, clutching his palms, dragging him toward a tomorrow he can barely grasp. Behind him lies everything he erected, everything he labored for, everything that established his achievement in society's measurements. Ahead extends uncertainty and deprivation, and the horrifying liberation of possessing no alternative but to place confidence in commitments he had nearly forgotten how to accept. Lot's spouse walks alongside him for a duration, but her inner being remains behind with the existence they are abandoning. When she rotates for one final observation, she transforms into a memorial to the peril of cherishing the incorrect things too profoundly. Lot stumbles ahead with his daughters, an individual stripped of everything, excluding existence itself and the opportunity to commence once more. The cave in the slopes becomes their protection, but it shelters more than merely their physical forms. It contains the bitter product of choices executed in ease and accommodation, received in modest increments. It transforms into the location where despair produces peoples and humiliation becomes patrimony. The journey to Moab commences in Sodom's entrances, but it concludes in that obscure hollow where the tomorrow assumes form beneath the burden of a yesterday that can never be reversed. In forfeiting Sodom, Lot forfeits more than an urban center. He forfeits the individual he might have become, the parent he planned to be, the patrimony he anticipated leaving. What persists becomes the origin of something else, completely. A population created from the remains of accommodated aspirations and the frantic optimism that somehow, in some way, existence can emerge even from the wreckage of our most catastrophic failures. The beginnings of the Moabite people, a population created in humiliation, the infant delivered in that cavern, bears more than merely the burden of his extraordinary conception. He bears the merged patrimony of two ancient bloodlines, the favor of Abraham coursing through his grandfather's lineage, and the gathered accommodation that guided his family to this obscure commencement. From his initial respiration, Moab occupies the territory between commitment and deficiency, between divine approval and mortal weakness. His mother designates him with intentional purpose. Moab, meaning from father, a designation that guarantees he will never elude the situations of his delivery. Yet in that very frankness exists a variety of truthfulness that becomes representative of his progeny. The Moabite people will never be a population who conceal from harsh realities or adorn repulsive circumstances in attractive language. They comprehend what they are and from where they originated, and they construct their character on that unwavering understanding. As the youth develops, the slopes east of the Mineral Sea become his educational space and recreation area. These are territories that require fortitude from their occupants. Crimson Stone territory, where moisture must be deliberately pursued and intensely safeguarded, where the boundary between survival and catastrophe remains perpetually narrow. The terrain molds the youth as reliably as heredity and upbringing, instructing him to interpret the delicate indicators that signify the contrast between existence and mortality in the wasteland. His aunt, Lot's younger daughter, delivers her son, Ben-Ami, in the identical season. The two youths develop in proximity, relatives delivered beneath the identical, unusual celestial alignment, possessing the identical, intricate inheritance. They master hunting in the identical ravines, to locate moisture in the identical concealed water sources, to identify the vegetation that heals and the varieties that damage. Yet, from early childhood, contrasts surface between them that suggest the distinct fates awaiting their progeny. Moab demonstrates himself attracted to the elevated locations, the rocky projections that provide perspectives throughout the Jordan Valley toward the Western Territories, the wind-swept plateaus where an individual can position himself and sense himself commander of everything he observes. There exists something in his character that pursues elevation, both physical and sacred. Even as a youth, he erects modest altars of accumulated stones where he burns offerings to the divine forces he detects moving through his reality. The ceremonies he creates are his own invention, not absorbed from any tradition or received from any instructor. They combine partially retained fragments of Abraham's faith, filtered through his mother's flawed comprehension, with his own instinctive perception of the sacred. The resulting behaviors bear both reality and distortion, illumination and obscurity, in ratios that will mold his progeny's spirituality across coming centuries. As Moab achieves adulthood, others commence gathering surrounding him, traveling groups, relocated families, younger sons pursuing their opportunities. The Eastern Highlands attract those who discover no position in the established territories toward the West. Some arrive escaping obligation or humiliation. Others, attracted by accounts of a fresh leader who receives all arrivals regardless of their history. Moab's own beginning narrative renders him instinctively understanding to those who bear weights they cannot release. The initial Moabite settlements mirror this mixed inheritance. They construct their dwellings strong and protected, absorbing from severe experience that survival relies on alertness. Their agricultural areas are deliberately terraced to capture every portion of valuable precipitation. Their livestock are resilient varieties that can flourish on limited vegetation and harsh water. Everything regarding their initial civilization speaks of a population determined to establish permanent dwellings in territories others regard as scarcely suitable for habitation. Yet alongside this realistic adaptation flows a deeper current of sacred pursuit that distinguishes them from adjacent populations. The Moabite people create intricate ceremonies surrounding the rotation of seasons, sophisticated rituals for favoring harvests and livestock, detailed systems of prediction and prophetic insight. They appear motivated by a hunger to comprehend the divine intention, to position themselves appropriately in relationship to the cosmic forces that control existence and mortality, material success and catastrophe. This sacred intensity bears within it both authentic pursuit and perilous distortion. The favor of Abraham's lineage expresses itself in the Moabite people as a genuine responsiveness to divine matters, an authentic aspiration to honor and serve higher forces. But the situations of their beginning introduce difficulties that corrupt even their most sincere attempts into troublesome directions. They commence perceiving themselves as a population selected for a particular fate, but selected to position themselves in resistance to, rather than collaboration with their covenant relatives. They comprehend themselves as recipients of divine approval, but approval acquired through their own attempts rather than obtained as gracious gift. They create a theology that validates their division from the Western territories, while concurrently cultivating bitterness regarding that division. The deity they designate, Chemosh, surfaces from these mixed sacred currents as both defender and evaluator, both supplier and requiring commander. Chemosh cherishes the Moabite people with intense tribal devotion. But that devotion articulates itself through demands that develop more severe and expensive with each generation. What commences as straightforward offerings of grain and oil transforms toward behaviors that will eventually appall even pagans from other populations. Commercial routes commence developing through Moabite domain as the tribe develops into a population and the population matures into a people. Traveling merchants transporting valuable commodities between Egypt and Mesopotamia discover the highland roads more secure and more direct than the coastal options. The Moabite people master taxing this movement skillfully, supplying protection and provisions in exchange for consistent tribute that gradually constructs their prosperity and authority. Interaction with these traders delivers fresh concepts, fresh technologies, fresh methods of comprehending the reality. The Moabite people demonstrate themselves enthusiastic pupils, embracing improved techniques of metalworking, agriculture, and combat with the eagerness of a population determined to validate themselves equal to any challenge. Their urban centers develop larger and more spectacular, their military forces better supplied and more controlled, their rulers more refined in diplomacy and governance. Yet material success and advancement cannot eliminate the essential conflict at the core of Moabite character. They persist as the offspring of humiliation, the people delivered from frantic accommodation, the population who bear favor in their ancestry but cannot appear to utilize it completely. Every accomplishment feels like recompense for their beginning, every achievement like a justification against their history. Every instant of satisfaction, shadowed by the recollection of that cave, where everything commenced. As information arrives of developments in the Western territories, of a population summoned out of Egypt, of divine afflictions and supernatural rescues, of a people being formed from previous slaves beneath the guidance of one designated Moses, the Moabite people observe with intricate sentiments. Jealousy mingles with terror, inquisitiveness with bitterness, optimism with apprehension. Their covenant relatives are finally claiming their patrimony, and the Moabite people comprehend their own fate will somehow be molded by that claiming. The developed Moabite people that surfaces from these initial centuries bears all the intricacy of its beginning narrative. They are a population capable of extraordinary devotion and horrific brutality, of profound sacred perception and devastating moral sightlessness, of generous hospitality and relentless animosity. They represent both the optimal and worst possibilities of what mortals transform into when they attempt to manufacture purpose and meaning separate from the divine plan that molded their forebears. positioning themselves on their elevated locations as the sun descends beyond the western peaks, projecting extended shadows throughout the Moabite highlands. Moabite religious leaders present sacrifices that ascend like prayers into the obscuring atmosphere. They do not comprehend that throughout the Jordan, their kin are arranging for a journey that will deliver these two extensions of Abraham's ancestral line into direct collision. They cannot predict the approaching confrontation between their arduously acquired independence and their relatives' divine authorization. But they detect something approaching in the air current that flows from the wasteland. Something that will examine every presumption they have erected their character upon, challenge every narrative they have communicated to themselves regarding their value and their position in the cosmic arrangement. The people delivered in humiliation is about to discover whether humiliation can be converted through attempt and determination, or whether some beginnings project shadows too profound for any mortal illumination to penetrate. The foundation is established for a confrontation that will reverberate through history, an encounter between populations who possess too much ancestry to disregard each other, yet bear too much injury to welcome one another. In that encounter, the authentic significance of Moab's delivery will ultimately be exposed, not as the conclusion of their narrative, but as its unusual and troubled commencement. Moab, in the obscurity, existence before the Exodus. In the generations preceding the moment the world heard of Moses or marveled at Egypt's afflictions, the Moabite people erected their civilization in the consistent cadence of seasons and years, unmarked by spectacular divine involvements. Theirs became a narrative composed in stone terraces carved from hillsides, in copper extraction sites excavated profound into mountain cores, in commercial stations that emerged like blossoms along the merchant routes traversing their highlands. The progeny of Moab mastered interpreting their terrain with the intimate understanding that only emerges from remaining in one location sufficiently extended to comprehend its temperaments and seasons. They uncovered that the crimson sandstone formations contained concealed water sources, if you comprehended where to pay attention for the quality of moisture moving through rock. They discovered that particular ravines captured morning condensation in methods that rendered them optimal for cultivating grapes, while others confronted the solar light precisely appropriate for ripening grain, even in arid years. Their urban centers ascended organically from the contours of the territory, erected where protected heights provided protection, while persisting proximate to moisture sources and productive earth. Kir Moab, their most impressive stronghold, crowned a precipitous plateau that dominated perspectives in every orientation. Its fortifications appeared to develop from the living rock, massive blocks positioned together with the accuracy that emerges from generations of expert constructors refining their skill. Within these fortifications, Moabite civilization created its own characteristic patterns. Their artisans became recognized throughout the region for metallic craftsmanship that merged durability with aesthetic quality. Bronze, implements that maintained their sharpness through years of utilization, decorative containers that captured and mirrored illumination in methods that appeared nearly mystical to external visitors. Their textile workers manufactured fabrics whose vibrant hues originated from colorants extracted from highland vegetation, discovered nowhere else. Textiles, valued by traders willing to journey weeks to acquire them. The Moabite dialect transformed its own cadences and terminology, acquiring words from the numerous languages articulated by traders traversing through their domain while preserving grammatical frameworks that mirrored their distinctive method of comprehending the reality. Their poetic composition bore the rhythms of mountain air current and wasteland tempest. Their narrative traditions safeguarded recollections that extended backward to the earliest cycles of their establishment in the Eastern Highlands. Musical expression contained particular significance in Moabite civilization, possibly because a population delivered from such intricate situations required the restoration that emerges from melodic harmony and cadence. Their instruments mirrored the resources their territory supplied. Percussion instruments manufactured from deliberately treated sheepskin, extended over frameworks of wasteland hardwood, flutes carved from the hollow skeletal structures of large avians that migrated through their domain each spring, stringed instruments whose bodies were molded from gourds cultivated in their most protected ravines. Their sacred behaviors centered surrounding the elevated locations, organic or erected elevated sites where they accepted the division between earthly and divine realms, developed narrow. These sacred positions dotted the Moabite terrain like celestial bodies dispersed throughout the nocturnal atmosphere, each one serving particular functions in the intricate network of ritual and ceremony that controlled their sacred existences. Chemosh, their national deity, obtained the most intricate veneration, but the Moabite pantheon incorporated numerous lesser forces responsible for particular aspects of existence. Deities of the harvest, female deities of childbirth, entities that controlled meteorological patterns and safeguarded travelers. The ceremonies created to honor these divine entities developed progressively intricate as Moabite religious leaders elaborated theological frameworks designed to clarify and regulate the forces that molded their reality. Agriculture constituted the basis of Moabite material success, but their position along major commercial routes supplied opportunities for prosperity that extended far past what their agricultural areas and livestock could generate. They mastered serving as intermediaries between the magnificent civilizations of their period, supplying secure passage and fundamental services to merchant traveling groups while extracting tribute that financed their developing aspirations. Egyptian precious metal coursed through Moabite palms on its journey to northern markets, along with ivory from Africa, valuable minerals from Arabia, cedar timber from the northern peaks, and aromatic substances from territories so remote that their designations existed only in the narratives communicated by extensively traveled traders. The Moabite people created refined systems for assessing, preserving, and transporting these valuable commodities, becoming specialists in the intricate negotiations demanded for achievement in distant commerce. Their military transformed in reaction to the dual demands of safeguarding their commercial interests and protecting their domain from attackers who perceived their material success as an appealing objective. Moabite combatants became recognized for their proficiency, with swords and spears forged from iron they mastered, working in furnaces heated with charcoal manufactured from highland timber. Their mounted forces, positioned on horses, cultivated for persistence in rocky terrain, could attack rapidly at adversaries and vanish into territory they comprehended superior to any external individual ever could. The political framework that surfaced to control this developing material success balanced tribal traditions with the more intricate demands of administering commercial relationships and international diplomacy. Monarchs governed from Kir Moab, but their authority was restricted by assemblies of community leaders representing the various clans and commercial associations that constituted the foundation of Moabite civilization. These rulers confronted the persistent challenge of preserving Moabite independence while navigating the perilous currents of magnificent power politics that circulated surrounding their modest people. Egypt's authority fluctuated according to the fortitude of its current governing family. Mesopotamian kingdoms ascended and crumbled, each one temporarily extending its reach into the Levantine highlands before being substituted by the subsequent ambitious governor. The Moabite people mastered bending without shattering, paying tribute when required while safeguarding their fundamental autonomy. Their diplomatic correspondence, safeguarded in archives carved into formation surfaces and heated clay monuments, exposes a population proficient at manipulating larger forces against each other while evading the variety of conclusive obligations that might validate expensive when political air currents shifted. They perfected the craft of being valuable, sufficiently to safeguard, but not threatening sufficiently to subjugate, beneficial sufficiently to pursue, but not prosperous, sufficiently to stimulate direct annexation. Instruction in Moabite civilization emphasized realistic proficiencies alongside cultural safeguarding. Youngsters mastered reading and composing, utilizing systems conformed from various adjacent civilizations. But the documents they examined incorporated distinctly Moabite wisdom literature, legal frameworks, and sacred poetry. Young males training for governance examined not only their own traditions, but also the dialects and customs of the populations they might eventually require negotiating with as adults. Females in Moabite civilization experienced relatively elevated status, possibly because their foundational narrative involved the initiative executed by Lot's daughters in guaranteeing their family's continuation. Female religious leaders served significant functions in sacred ceremonies, particularly those associated with productivity and the agricultural rotation. Commercial families frequently entrusted their trading operations to capable daughters when sons demonstrated less aptitude for commerce. The creative disciplines flourished in this atmosphere of material success and cultural assurance. Moabite sculptors manufactured works that merged influences from numerous traditions while articulating distinctly regional sensibilities. Their ceramic work demonstrated technical superiority in both functional and decorative objects, frequently featuring geometric patterns that mirrored their highland environment's organic forms and hues. Yet beneath all this visible achievement flowed deeper currents of sacred pursuit and cultural apprehension that mirrored their distinctive position as a population who comprehended themselves to be both favored and condemned, selected and refused, linked to magnificent commitments they could not completely claim. Moabite literature, safeguarded in temple libraries, exposes a population struggling with inquiries regarding divine fairness, national fate, and the significance of suffering that extends past what material success can address. Their prophetic figures and intelligent individuals created refined theological clarifications for their people's peculiar status, theories that portrayed Moab as selected for a particular role that demanded division from, rather than integration with their covenant relatives. These instructions assisted validating their independence while supplying frameworks for comprehending the intricate sentiments that surfaced whenever information arrived from the Western territories where Abraham's other progeny resided and struggled. As the generations transpired and Egypt's authority over Hebrew slaves developed more oppressive, Moabite observers observed with interest but minimal direct concern. The sufferings of remote relatives appeared like difficulties belonging to another reality, pertinent to their own situation only, as they might influence commercial routes or regional stability. They had erected something meaningful and enduring in their highland sanctuary, something that appeared secure sufficiently to persist whatever transformations might sweep throughout the broader ancient Near Eastern region. But security erected on mortal attempt and political calculation, however proficient, persists vulnerable to forces past mortal regulation or anticipation. In Egypt, a Hebrew infant concealed among river vegetation was developing into adulthood with a divine summons that would transform the entire region's distribution of authority. The Moabite people, comfortable in their mountain strongholds, could not yet conceive how profoundly their deliberately erected reality was about to transform. The obscurity that had protected their creation was commencing to shift as divine intentions extended, held in suspension, arranged to advance into the complete illumination of history. The population delivered from humiliation in a hillside cavern was about to uncover whether their centuries of accomplishment had arranged them to confront the covenant population whose fate they possessed but could not elude. The Exodus and the approaching tempest. Information travels gradually in the ancient reality, transported by traders and traveling narrative tellers whose accounts develop more intricate with each communication. But some narratives arrive with the unmistakable gravity of reality, bearing details too unusual to be fabricated and implications too severe to disregard. Such are the accounts that commence filtering into Moabite domain from the orientation of Egypt, narratives of afflictions that resist organic clarification, of a population journeying liberated from centuries of servitude, of divine authority moving visibly through mortal circumstances. Initially, the Moabite people obtained these accounts with the doubtful interest they might demonstrate toward any exotic narrative from remote territories. Egypt has perpetually been a source of captivating narratives, accounts of divine monarchs and massive monuments, of ceremonial mysteries and political complications. The concept that Hebrew slaves might have somehow eluded their controllers appears no more extraordinary than any other political upheaval in that ancient and intricate kingdom. But the accounts persist arriving, and they possess particular details that become impossible to reject. Moisture transforming to blood throughout an entire waterway system, obscurity substantial enough to physically touch, covering the territory for 3 cycles. The abrupt mortality of every firstborn offspring and animal in a solitary evening. These are not the varieties of details that surface from ordinary political disturbance or military subjugation. They communicate intervention by forces that diminish mortal comprehension. Monarch Sihon of Heshbon, whose domain borders Moabite territories toward the north, transmits urgent communications, pursuing information and guidance. His observation units account for massive movements of individuals in the wasteland regions between Egypt and Canaan. Not the dispersed migration of wandering tribes pursuing fresh grazing lands, but the arranged march of a people in movement. Calculations of quantities vary dramatically, but even the most conservative propose a population far larger than anything the Eastern Highlands have ever witnessed. Moabite intelligence networks, deliberately cultivated through generations of commercial relationships, commence gathering more particular information regarding this Hebrew exodus. The individuals involved are indeed the progeny of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, whose family had established themselves in Egypt during a period of scarcity centuries earlier. They had multiplied there, past anyone's anticipations, eventually transforming so numerous that Egyptian governors feared they might unite with adversaries in periods of warfare. The leader of this Hebrew emancipation appears to be an individual designated Moses, someone with connections to both Hebrew and Egyptian civilizations, but claiming to articulate with direct divine power. The accounts portray him as executing signs and marvels that persuaded not only his own population, but even Pharaoh's assembly of his supernatural backing. The afflictions that devastated Egypt arrived at his declaration, and the ultimate exodus transpired when he committed divine safeguarding for the Hebrew families who adhered to particular ceremonial instructions. More troubling to Moabite perception are the accounts of what transpired at the Sea of Reeds when Pharaoh's military attempted to prevent the Hebrew departure. Observers portray waters dividing to manufacture a dry pathway, then collapsing backward together to obliterate pursuing chariots and mounted forces. The very forces of the natural world appear to be aligned with Hebrew interests in methods that propose intentions far past ordinary political emancipation. As these extraordinary narratives establish themselves into Moabite awareness, their implications become progressively evident. The Hebrews are not merely another relocated population pursuing fresh dwellings in the sparsely established regions east of Jordan. They are a population claiming divine authorization to occupy particular domains that incorporate territories the Moabite people regard as their own sphere of authority. The approaching tempest will not traverse harmlessly past, abandoning Moabite interests untouched. Monarch Balak, who governs from the fortress urban center of Kir Moab, summons his counselors together to evaluate their people's reaction to these developments. The deliberations that transpire expose profound divisions within Moabite governance regarding how to interpret the Hebrew assertions and what approach might optimally safeguard Moabite independence. Some assembly immediate military arrangement, contending that early resistance provides the optimal optimism of terminating Hebrew expansion before it acquires unstoppable momentum. Others promote diplomatic solutions, proposing that accommodation with the Hebrew people might serve Moabite interests superior to armed resistance. After all, both populations claim descent from Abraham, and familial relationships occasionally supply foundations for mutually beneficial arrangements. Perhaps tribute or territorial concessions might acquire tranquility with these divinely favored relatives. A third faction urges sacred consultation before executing any conclusive reaction. The Hebrew achievement in Egypt evidently involved supernatural involvement, and practical wisdom proposes acquiring more regarding the divine forces supporting them before selecting to position themselves in resistance. Moabite religious leaders are dispatched to their elevated locations to execute prediction ceremonies that might expose divine intention regarding the approaching catastrophe. The outcomes of these sacred inquiries validate troubling and unclear. Some indicators propose that resistance to the Hebrew advance will deliver catastrophe upon Moab. Others appear to commit divine support for Moabite protection of their homeland. The competing interpretations mirror the intricate theological position Moab has perpetually occupied, linked to covenant favor through their Abrahamic ancestry, yet divided from it through the situations of their beginning and the selections executed by their forebears. While Moabite rulers debate approach, realistic arrangements for collision commence throughout their domain. Armaments are sharpened and multiplied in quantity through intensive labor in metalworking facilities that burn continuously throughout cycles. Sustenance provisions are accumulated and preserved in fortified positions that might sustain populations through extended blockades. Partnerships are reinforced with adjacent populations who possess Moabite concerns regarding Hebrew expansion. The Ammonite people, progeny of Benami and thus Moab's closest kin, validate organic collaborators in these protective arrangements. Their domain lies directly in the route the Hebrews must traverse if they intend to approach Canaan from the east, rendering armed collision virtually unavoidable unless accommodation can be obtained. Combined Moabite and Ammonite forces represent a meaningful military challenge that might provide even a divinely supported adversary justification for concern. Emissaries race between the capitals of various modest peoples throughout the eastern highlands, transporting proposals for broader coalitions against the Hebrew threat. The descendants of Esau, and thus also related to the approaching population, confront similar selections regarding resistance or accommodation. Their decisions will meaningfully influence the strategic options accessible to Moab and its collaborators. Reports from intelligence sources regarding Hebrew numerical strength and combat readiness become increasingly comprehensive as this migrating population advances nearer to regions where Moabite concerns are immediately at stake. What becomes apparent offers both reason for optimism and cause for alarm among those strategizing Moabite defensive measures. The Hebrew people journey with their complete array of belongings, livestock, household members, aging family, and small children, indicating they aren't chiefly structured for swift tactical operations. Such an enormous non-combatant assembly ought to be susceptible to strikes from agile units knowledgeable about regional geography. Nevertheless, these same intelligence accounts describe Hebrew battlefield triumphs against various adversaries they've faced throughout their wilderness travels. Their warriors appear well-trained and effectively synchronized, commanded by leaders who merge strategic competence with unwavering certainty regarding the moral righteousness of their mission. Furthermore, their conquests frequently involve conditions that hint at otherworldly aid, abrupt meteorological shifts that benefit Hebrew troops, Opposing armies that appear to collapse through internal disorder and terror, supply challenges that find resolution through unanticipated discoveries of provisions and hydration. The mental effect of these accounts on Moabite communities proves equally significant as their tactical ramifications. A civilization can make ready for battle against mortal foes using conventional approaches of coalition building, defensive construction, and operational organization. However, how does one make ready for confrontation with adversaries who profess celestial endorsement and appear to obtain it in quantifiable forms? The fundamental basis of standard military assessment begins to transform when otherworldly elements must be incorporated into strategic consideration. Spiritual authorities across Moab discover themselves confronting inquiries they've never been compelled to tackle head-on. Their religious framework has consistently recognized the presence of mighty celestial entities beyond their tribal god Chemosh. Yet the Hebrew assertions suggest a degree of divine participation in mortal matters that questions core presumptions about how the universal structure functions. If the Hebrew deity genuinely possesses the capabilities ascribed to him, what implications does that hold for other heavenly beings and the civilizations who honor them? Certain Moabite religious officials start formulating theological rationales that could maintain their civilization's spiritual morale while recognizing Hebrew otherworldly benefits. Maybe the Hebrew god's strength is constrained to particular territorial zones or certain categories of action. Maybe their current victories signify transient celestial approval that will ultimately be rescinded when their ethical conduct falls short of divine expectations. Maybe Chemosh is merely biding his time, awaiting the proper occasion to reveal his own strength against these Hebrew intruders. Still, even these optimistic readings cannot completely silence the profound anxieties that emerge from considering the Hebrew Exodus account. The catastrophes that ravaged Egypt struck that civilization's deities, in addition to its population, revealing divine strength that surpassed conventional limits between rival spiritual frameworks. The currents of the Red Sea responded to Hebrew direction while annihilating Egyptian armies, indicating mastery over physical forces that reaches well past regional authority. These aren't the sorts of restricted celestial actions that fit easily within established theological structures. As the spring season progresses toward summer and Hebrew displacement brings them constantly nearer to regions where Moabite concerns cannot be dismissed, King Balak confronts the most challenging judgment of his rule. Conventional counsel advises against engaging foes whose celestial backing seems so impressive. Yet, surrendering without opposition could encourage Hebrew requirements that expand increasingly burdensome as they learn how readily Moabite determination can be shattered. The decision grows more pressing as intelligence reaches them, detailing Hebrew engagements with other populations, obstructing their planned path toward Canaan. Certain groups obtain safe transit in return for sensible arrangements, authorization to acquire provisions and hydration, assurances of non-violent passage across their lands, commitments not to establish permanent settlements in territories already possessed by others. But populations who decline these propositions or assault Hebrew units experience total annihilation with a completeness that indicates intentional policy instead of simple battlefield requirement. Moabite watchers start comprehending that they're observing the execution of a celestial directive that permits only restricted mortal response choices. Compliance with Hebrew stipulations provides continuation, though potentially at expenditures that could prove challenging to sustain. Opposition guarantees catastrophe, though the form and schedule of that disaster stay uncertain. Neither alternative maintains the existing arrangement that has served Moabite welfare so effectively for successive generations. The advancing tempest holds within itself the capacity to reorganize the complete governmental and spiritual terrain of the eastern plateaus. Populations who have existed together for ages as adjacent communities and commercial associates now discover themselves compelled to select positions in a struggle whose resolution could establish their continued presence. The equilibrium of influence that has permitted smaller civilizations to preserve sovereignty through prudent statecraft confronts disruption by powers that function by completely different principles. Balak's reconnaissance forces indicate that the Hebrew masses have started advancing in configurations that imply they're making ready for the subsequent segment of their expedition toward their guaranteed legacy. The interval of wilderness migration that succeeded their Egyptian emancipation seems to be approaching toward culmination. Shortly they will commence claiming lands they trust their deity has vowed to them, and that claiming will necessitate removing present occupants who possess their own entitlements founded on successive generations of habitation and cultivation. The tempest that commenced with Hebrew bondsmen crying beneath Egyptian brutality is prepared to descend over the plateaus east of Jordan with intensity that will challenge every premise Moab has constructed its society upon. The population originating in a cavern from frantic accommodation are prepared to learn whether their ages of accomplishment have equipped them to endure celestial assessment, or whether their essential disconnection from covenant favor renders them vulnerable against covenant strength. In the remoteness, dirt plumes on the skyline indicate the arrival of a civilization that holds within itself simultaneously guarantee and danger, favor and condemnation, expectation for certain individuals and dread for different ones. The Moabites observe from their elevated fortifications, understanding that their reaction to what advances will establish whether their designation endures in chronicles as a warning narrative or vanishes completely underneath the progressing surge of Hebrew fate. The approaching tempest will disclose which foundations can resist celestial intention and which deteriorate when examined by powers beyond mortal capacity to withstand. For Moab, the examination approaches with the unavoidable certainty of sunrise succeeding night, holding within itself the ultimate settlement of conflicts that originated in that cavern where their forefather initially breathed beneath alien constellations. King Balak and the prophet for compensation. Anxiety spreads through the plateau stronghold of Kir-Hareseth like cold season gusts through mountainous passages, unseen yet unmistakable in its impact. King Balak paces the ramparts of his citadel at first light, his gaze searching the sunrise horizon, where dirt clouds have remained observable for 72 hours, currently. The Hebrew congregation advances nearer with every elapsing moment, and alongside them arrives a predicament that will examine every presumption upon which Moabite authority depends. The monarch's counselors have supplied him with comprehensive intelligence regarding this approaching civilization. Their quantities surpass anything witnessed in the territory within recent recall, possibly 600,000 combat-ready males, in addition to their households, animals, and properties. They advance with the structured arrangement of a population unified by collective objective and celestial commission. Most troubling of everything, they transport with them an atmosphere of otherworldly preference that has permitted them to surmount hindrances that ought to have been unachievable to overcome. Balak has absorbed the narratives repeatedly by this point, each recounting contributing fresh particulars that render them increasingly rather than decreasingly credible. Hydration extracted from unbroken stone to revive a parched congregation. Nourishment manifesting each sunrise like moisture across their settlement, maintaining hundreds of thousands for lunar cycles without interruption. Adversaries more numerous and superior equipped than themselves, tumbling before Hebrew armies with a regularity that implies beyond mortal clarification. The governmental assessment seems uncomplicated, yet horrifying. Straightforward armed clash with this Hebrew civilization would be self-destruction for Moab, irrespective of how numerous partners could be assembled for the attempt. Their quantitative benefit by itself would devastate any alliance the eastern plateaus could gather. Incorporate to that their evident celestial endorsement, and opposition becomes not simply pointless, but conceivably ruinous for any population, courageous or unwise, sufficient to undertake it. Still, capitulating without opposition holds its own perils. A monarch who relinquishes his civilization's autonomy without even endeavoring to protect it welcomes contestations from his own aristocracy and potentially incursion from different adjacent powers who construe such vulnerability as occasion. Furthermore, the Hebrew stipulations could prove so burdensome that compliance becomes unachievable to preserve across duration, producing confrontation under even less advantageous conditions. Balak discovers himself confined between alternatives that guarantee catastrophe through separate routes. Conventional armed remedies provide only the assurance of failure. Strategic possibilities stay unexplored because the Hebrews haven't yet formulated particular requirements, abandoning Moabite mediators without distinct boundaries for prospective arrangements. The circumstance requires unconventional methodologies to difficulties that surpass standard governmental divisions. In this desperate situation, Balak's considerations shift toward otherworldly remedies. If the Hebrew benefit originates from celestial endorsement, maybe divine action on Moab's account could equalize the authority balance. The monarch's familiarity with territorial spiritual customs includes recognition of prophets and fortune-tellers whose standing reaches well past their immediate lands. Among these individuals, one designation emerges for the extraordinary range of his purported capabilities. Balaam, son of Beor, resides in the upper territories near the mighty waterway, where he has established a standing that extends across numerous realms and societies. Unlike regional priests connected to particular deities or lands, Balaam professes universal spiritual command, the capacity to interface with celestial powers irrespective of their tribal or ethnic connections. More critically for Balak's present requirements, Balaam's standing includes victorious maledictions that have delivered disaster upon his patron's adversaries. The accounts told regarding Balaam's capability suggest precisely the variety of action Moab requires in its present predicament. Urban centers that rejected his cautions have succumbed to pestilence or seismic activity. Military forces that advanced against his patrons have encountered failure through abrupt terror or provision breakdowns. Monarchs who dismissed his guidance have forfeited their positions to competitors who demonstrated more open to his spiritual perceptions. Whether through genuine otherworldly talent or exceptional proficiency at interpreting governmental and environmental patterns, Balaam's history of triumphant forecasts and productive actions has rendered him the most desired fortune-teller in the territory. Nevertheless, Balaam's assistance arrives at an expenditure that mirrors his distinctive standing and demonstrated talents. His compensation surpasses what most monarchs can manage for routine consultations, and his requirements for particular categories of recompense frequently include stipulations that examine his patron's dedication to adhering to his direction. More demanding still, Balaam declines to receive assignments unless his preliminary fortune-telling implies that achievement is feasible. He has constructed his standing partially by preventing connection with unsuccessful ventures that could damage his perception of otherworldly productivity. King Balak confronts the sensitive responsibility of contacting this costly and particular prophet with an appeal that could seem frantic enough to encourage rejection or manipulation. The communication he composes must transmit the pressing nature of Moab's circumstance, while indicating that employment by a plateau monarch provides Balaam possibilities deserving of his abilities and standing. The assignment must appear sufficiently attractive to captivate someone who receives the consideration of mightier realms, yet particular enough to signal earnest purpose instead of simple terror. The delegation Balak gathers to transport his proposition mirrors the significance he assigns on obtaining Balaam's assistance. prominent Moabite aristocrats combine with distinguished Midianite partners in a representation whose arrangement reveals that numerous realms endorse this effort. They transport offerings precious enough to demonstrate regard for Balaam's position, yet deliberately selected to imply that considerably superior compensation awaits if the prophet's action demonstrates effective. The communication they convey merges complement with pressing need in ratios designed to inspire without seeming calculating. Balak recognizes Balaam's standing while portraying the Hebrew danger in expressions formulated to attract someone whose livelihood relies on assisting patrons surmount seemingly unachievable obstacles. The suggested compensation framework guarantees instant recompense for consultation, in addition to considerable bonuses connected to quantifiable outcomes in diminishing Hebrew advancement toward Moabite lands. Still, underneath the strategic wording and precise estimations flows a stream of authentic despair that mirrors how thoroughly the Hebrew arrival has interrupted conventional designs of territorial governance. Balak isn't simply pursuing another instrument in the standard collection of armed and strategic possibilities. He's grasping for otherworldly action because natural options seem insufficient to confront the predicament confronting his realm. The judgment to recruit Balaam signifies beyond tactical practicality. It mirrors an essential transformation in how Moab comprehends its standing in the universal structure. For successive generations, Moabite monarchs have depended on their own capacity, their partnerships, and their guardian deity Chemosh to safeguard and promote their tribal welfare. Currently, Balak discovers himself pursuing assistance from a foreign fortune-teller whose strength derives from origins outside the conventional spiritual frameworks that have directed Moabite strategy. This transformation holds theological ramifications that reach well past immediate armed concerns. By hiring Balaam, Balak implicitly recognizes that the celestial powers supporting the Hebrew progression may surpass what Moab's conventional spiritual assets can oppose. The action signifies simultaneously pragmatic intelligence and spiritual accommodation, an acknowledgement that Moabite theology could be insufficient to confront the obstacles presented by Hebrew covenant assertions. The contradiction of this circumstance wouldn't be overlooked by witnesses acquainted with Moab's beginnings and chronicle. A population whose forefather originated from Lot's disconnection from Abraham's covenant heritage now discovers itself compelled to pursue otherworldly help against Abraham's different offspring. The disconnection that commenced in a cavern east of Sodom has produced a clash where Moab must hire foreign spiritual proficiency to protect against kinsmen whose celestial endorsement they cannot equal through their own assets. As Balak's delegation journeys northward, transporting propositions and appeals to the renowned prophet, the monarch returns to his ramparts to observe the arriving Hebrew dirt plumes. The governmental and armed arrangements for clash persist, but progressively they seem like motions performed more from routine than expectation. The genuine protection of Moab currently depends in the possession of a prophet whose standing surpasses his dependability, whose strength stays unverified against adversaries who assert straightforward celestial commission for their movements. The plateau stronghold that has shielded Moabite sovereignty for successive generations abruptly seems delicate as sunrise vapor, susceptible to powers that function by principles Balak cannot completely comprehend or oppose through traditional approaches. His realm's continuation may rely on whether a compensated prophet can achieve what military forces and partnerships cannot, redirecting a civilization that advances under celestial safeguarding toward a legacy they trust their deity has vowed them. In pursuing otherworldly assistance against otherworldly resistance, Balak has initiated occurrences whose ramifications will reach well past his immediate predicament. The impact between Hebrew fate and Moabite despair is prepared to generate encounters that will disclose the authentic character of celestial strength and the constraints of mortal strategies to redirect it toward objectives of their own. Selection. The speaking beast and celestial obstruction. The sunrise climbs beyond the Sunrise Mountains as Balaam makes ready for his expedition southward toward the territory of Moab. His attendants burden transport creatures with the provisions and ritual objects necessary for the intricate fortune-telling ceremonies King Balak has requested. The precious metals transported by Balak's envoys shine in the dawn illumination, concrete proof of how frantically the Moabite monarch requires otherworldly action against the Hebrew danger arriving at his lands. Balaam's standing depends on his capability to perceive celestial intention and affect otherworldly powers on account of patrons prepared to compensate his considerable charges. Monarchs and nobles across the territory pursue his guidance because his history of precise forecasts and productive actions surpasses that of any competing practitioner. Still, this assignment introduces exceptional obstacles that render even an accomplished fortune-teller hesitant about assuring particular results. The Hebrew population advancing toward Moabite lands transport with them celestial endorsement that reveals itself in forms Balaam has never faced in his broad profession. Their emancipation from Egypt required otherworldly actions that devastated one of the historical world's mightiest realms. Their continuation in the wilderness relies on miraculous provisions that maintain hundreds of thousands of individuals in territories where a handful would typically struggle to locate sufficient nourishment and hydration. Throughout the prior evening's fortune-telling gathering, Balaam obtained celestial transmission that abandoned him distressed and hesitant. The spiritual domain disclosed competing streams of intention that implied this Hebrew assignment involves powers beyond standard divisions of favor and condemnation. Celestial entities, whose command surpasses territorial or tribal limits, seem to be straightforwardly participating in Hebrew matters, rendering outside action challenging in forms that could imperil any prophet daring enough to undertake it. Still, the compensation provided by King Balak signifies the most substantial assignment of Balaam's profession. Sufficient riches to guarantee pleasant withdrawal or finance growth of his functions, to assist even mightier realms. The enticement to receive such profitable employment stays powerful despite the spiritual cautions that recommend hesitation. Maybe careful ritual arrangement and suitable sacrificial presentations could supply safeguarding for an accomplished fortune-teller undertaking to operate against celestially preferred adversaries. Balaam's pale beast of burden, a dependable creature that has transported him securely through years of journeys to remote consultations, appears exceptionally agitated this sunrise. The animal shifts anxiously as restraints and riding equipment are modified, its hearing organs rotating continuously, as though detecting sounds its master cannot perceive. Such conduct is exceptional for a creature recognized for consistent disposition and dependable reaction to acquainted procedures. The pathway southward toward Moab traces historical commercial passages that curve through lowlands and over elevations in the plateau territory between the mighty waterway and the wilderness territories, where the Hebrew congregation settles. These routes have transported Balaam to prior consultations without complication. However, today, the expedition seems distinct from its initial movements. The atmosphere itself appears filled with strain that renders both creature and master observant to perils that stay invisible yet somehow manifest. The sun ascends higher as the modest group makes consistent advancement along acquainted routes. Balaam travels in pleasant reflection of the riches, anticipating him in Moab, examining in his consciousness the ritual sequences he will utilize to achieve King Balak's aims. The fortune-telling necessary for condemning a complete civilization surpasses standard custom in range and intricacy. However, his background and standing validate assurance in ultimate achievement. Without caution, the beast of burden halts abruptly in the center of the route, its complete form shaking with anxiety of something only it can sense. Balaam encourages the creature onward with speech and pressure, but the animal declines to proceed despite progressively severe directions. Its vision stays concentrated on vacant atmosphere forward, as though observing hindrances that obstruct the route, though the pathway seems thoroughly unobstructed to mortal perception. Irritated by this unanticipated interruption, when pressing need requires rapid journey, Balaam strikes the beast with his rod to compel compliance. The creature reacts by lurching sideways from the principal route into a vineyard, compressing Balaam's appendage against a rock barrier in its terror to prevent whatever menaces from forward. The discomfort and disruption of this deviation add fury to the fortune-teller's irritation with his typically dependable transport. He strikes the beast again, more harshly this occasion, until it returns hesitantly to the route and continues southward journey. However, the creature's conduct stays unpredictable, its concentration directed on dangers that remain beyond mortal awareness. Every several movements bring restored indications of anxiety. Hearing organs flattened, musculature tense, periodic shaking that communicates of dread, deliberately restrained, yet never completely suppressed. The route forward constricts as it crosses between vineyard barriers that permit minimal space for maneuvering. At this location, the beast's terror achieves emergency proportions. The creature hurls itself against the rock barriers, frantically pursuing escape from unseen peril, compressing Balaam's lower limbs in its frantic endeavors to locate security. The bodily discomfort merges with mortification at the display. His purportedly well-instructed transport is generating for any witnesses who could observe such undignified conduct. The striking that succeeds surpasses anything Balaam has formerly administered to the loyal creature. His rod ascends and descends with the intensity of a person whose vocational respectability endures harm from conditions beyond his authority or comprehension. Every strike conveys not solely instant fury, but profound irritation with otherworldly powers that appear resolved to obstruct his profitable expedition to Moab. Then the unachievable occurs. The beast of burden rotates its cranium toward its owner and communicates with distinct mortal words that hold criticism and confusion in equivalent proportion. "What have I performed to you, that you have struck me these 3 occasions?" The inquiry suspends in the atmosphere like vapor from sacrificial flames, completely unachievable to reject, yet similarly unachievable to receive by standard comprehension of how the reality functions. Balaam's reaction discloses how thoroughly the sunrise's irritations have interrupted his standard spiritual perception. Rather than acknowledging the miraculous character of transmission from a creature, he disputes with the animal as though such exchanges were thoroughly routine because you have ridiculed me. If I possessed a blade in my possession, I would terminate you immediately. His fury blinds him to the otherworldly action occurring straightforwardly before his vision. The beast's response holds intelligence that surpasses its owner's present spiritual awareness. "Am I not your beast of burden, which you have traveled upon all your existence to this moment? Have I ever been habituated to perform thus to you?" The inquiry compels acknowledgement that this conduct signifies substantial deviation from designs formed through years of loyal assistance. Something exceptional must be producing movements so thoroughly opposite to the creature's formed disposition. Only then does celestial action disclose itself in configurations that mortal vision can sense. The heavenly messenger becomes observable to Balaam, positioned in the route with extracted blade that would have signified termination for any who undertook to cross. The otherworldly entity that the beast of burden perceived from the commencement currently manifests to mortal perception as well, clarifying the creature's frantic undertakings to prevent what seemed to be definite annihilation. The vision drops Balaam's countenance first to the surface, in dread and acknowledgement of how proximate he has arrived to catastrophe through spiritual sightlessness. The heavenly messenger's words validate that the beast's apparently irrational conduct genuinely revealed intelligence that maintained both their existences. "Why have you struck your beast of burden these 3 occasions? Observe. I have emerged to resist you, because your route is corrupt before me. The beast of burden perceived me and rotated aside from me these 3 occasions. If she had not rotated aside from me, assuredly by this time I would have terminated you and permitted her to exist. The clash discloses strata of significance that reach well past instant inquiries of journey and terminus. Balaam's standing as a prophet who transmits with celestial powers has not equipped him to acknowledge otherworldly resistance when it reveals itself in unanticipated configurations. His spiritual arrogance has blinded him to cautions that a basic creature sensed distinctly from the commencement. The precise proficiency he markets to prosperous patrons has transformed into a hindrance to perceiving celestial intention when it opposes his vocational aspirations. More importantly, the encounter reveals that the Hebrew expedition toward their guaranteed legacy functions under celestial safeguarding that reaches even to obstructing their adversaries from acquiring otherworldly help against them. The deity who emancipated them from Egypt and maintains them in the wilderness additionally observes undertakings to condemn them, intercepting such attempts before they can produce impact. Balaam's acknowledgement recognizes both instant error and profound spiritual breakdown. I have transgressed, for I did not understand that you positioned in the route against me. Currently, therefore, if it is corrupt in your perception, I will reverse direction. Still, the heavenly messenger's reaction implies that the expedition may persist, though under stipulations that will reshape its objective completely. Proceed with the persons, yet communicate only the expression that I will convey to you. The celestial authorization to advance holds within itself the origins of results thoroughly opposite to those King Balak anticipates to acquire through his abundant recompense. Balaam will arrive at Moab as organized, but the otherworldly action that halted his beast of burden guarantees that his expressions will fulfill celestial instead of mortal intentions. The prophet hired to condemn will discover himself obligated to favor irrespective of his vocational responsibilities or individual financial welfare. As the modest group continues its southward expedition, both traveler and transport journey with fresh recognition of the otherworldly powers encircling their assignment. The beast of burden that rescued its owner's existence through loyal caution returns to standard conduct. Having completed its temporary function as channel for celestial transmission, Balaam travels onward toward riches and recognition. Not yet thoroughly understanding that he journeys toward an encounter that will reshape his standing from beneficial fortune-teller to reluctant prophet of the precise population he was hired to condemn. The speaking beast of burden vanishes back into routine creature presence, but its expressions resonate in recollection as verification to celestial strength that functions through the most humble approaches to achieve intentions that surpass mortal comprehension or control. In rescuing its owner from annihilation, the loyal animal has additionally maintained him for a function in celestial performance that will disclose the pointlessness of mortal strategies resistant to celestial intention. 3 sacrificial sites, 3 declarations. Condemnations transform to favors. King Balak anticipates at the perimeter of his lands with barely restrained worry. His vision searching the upper approaches for indications of the prophet he has requested at such substantial expenditure. The Hebrew congregation settles within observation of Moabite communities currently, their manifestation a persistent indication of the predicament endangering his realm's continuation. Every moment of postponement amplifies the strain on both strategic and armed arrangements that expand more insufficient as the scale of the Hebrew danger becomes more apparent. When Balaam ultimately reaches with his modest company, the comfort in Balak's salutation mingles with irritation at the evident postponement. Did I not pressing dispatch to you to request you? Why did you not arrive to me? Am I not capable to respect you? The monarch's expressions hold undertones of despair, inadequately concealed by royal command. His realm's destiny may rely on this foreign fortune-teller's capability to neutralize otherworldly powers, shielding the Hebrew progression. Balaam's reaction discloses the complications that have previously commenced to reorganize his assignment. Observe, I have arrived to you. Have I currently any capacity whatsoever to communicate anything? The expression that the celestial assigns in my oral cavity that I shall communicate. The prophet's deliberately selected expressions imply that his typical vocational independence has been jeopardized by the celestial encounter that characterized his expedition to Moab. Still, both persons continue as though standard fortune-telling customs could still achieve Balak's aims. The monarch has arranged elaborate ritual configurations formulated to maximize the productivity of condemning ceremonies against the Hebrew population. 3 distinct positions have been chosen for their tactical and spiritual benefits, every one providing commanding perspectives of Hebrew settlements while supplying suitable environments for the intricate sacrificial sequences necessary for significant condemning functions. The initial selected location ascends elevated beyond the encircling lowlands, providing comprehensive perspectives that permit visual connection with the complete Hebrew settlement. At this place, Balaam directs the assembly of 7 sacrificial sites, positioned by designs that mirror his comprehension of universal powers and celestial inclinations. The quantity 7 holds sacred importance in numerous spiritual customs, while the sacrificial site configuration generates concentration locations for assembling otherworldly strength toward particular aims. The sacrificial stipulations Balaam designates mirror the scale of the assignment he has received: 7 bulls and 7 rams, creatures whose worth surpasses what most monarchs would allocate on routine spiritual observations. Every animal must satisfy demanding criteria of bodily flawlessness that reveal suitable regard for the celestial powers being requested. The expenditure by itself indicates that exceptional actions are being solicited through these presentations. King Balak participates individually in the ritual arrangements, his manifestation contributing royal command to ritual proceedings formulated to affect both mortal witnesses and otherworldly powers. The vapor ascending from 7 burning sacrificial sites generates an observable supplication that climbs towards celestial regions where universal judgments regarding mortal matters are rendered. The spectacle ought to motivate assurance in anyone acquainted with productive fortune-telling customs. Balaam retreats to an isolated location for the essential transmission segment of the ceremony, abandoning Balak beside the burning sacrifices to preserve spiritual connection between presentation and planned result. This disconnection permits the fortune-teller to obtain celestial communications without interruption, while guaranteeing that royal manifestation persists to sanctify the ritual location. The configuration traces designs that have demonstrated effective in prior consultations across Balaam's profession. However, the communication Balaam obtains throughout this spiritual consultation varies thoroughly from anything his vocational background has equipped him to anticipate. Rather than obtaining authorization or capacity to condemn the Hebrew population, he discovers himself provided expressions of favor that straightforwardly oppose his assignment and patron's anticipations. The celestial transmission abandons no space for vocational interpretation or alteration to accommodate mortal intentions. When Balaam returns to the sacrificial location where King Balak anticipates expectantly beside the smoking sacrifices, the prophet's countenance discloses that something unprecedented has transpired. The expressions he communicates hold celestial command that reshapes the complete ritual context, from condemning ceremony to favor declaration. From Aram Balak has transported me the monarch of Moab from the sunrise plateaus. Arrive, condemn Jacob for me, and arrive, denounce the offspring of Abraham. How can I condemn whom celestial strength has not condemned? And how can I denounce whom the heavenly domain has not denounced? For from the summit of the stones I perceive him, and from the elevations I observe him. Observe a population residing separately and not calculating itself among the civilizations. The favor persists with imagery that celebrates Hebrew distinctiveness and celestial preference, instead of requesting supernatural discipline upon them. Every phrase contributes insult to King Balak's harm by reshaping hired, condemning into reluctant celebration of the precise adversaries, endangering Moabite sovereignty. The ceremony planned to diminish Hebrew determination through otherworldly assault transforms, instead a public announcement of their favored condition and celestial safeguarding. Balak's reaction mingles outrage with confusion at this thorough reversal of anticipated results. "What have you performed to me? I transported you to condemn my adversaries, and observe, you have favored them certainly." His accusation mirrors not solely instant irritation, but profound bewilderment about how spiritual powers function when celestial intentions oppose mortal wishes. Balaam's clarification recognizes his forfeiture of vocational independence while undertaking to maintain expectation for subsequent achievement. "Must I not exercise caution to communicate what the celestial assigns in my oral cavity?" The prophet implies that maybe distinct ritual configurations at different positions could generate the wished condemning outcomes, though his manner holds minimal assurance in such opportunities. The subsequent undertaking traces comparable designs at a fresh position selected for distinct spiritual benefits. 7 sacrificial sites, 7 bulls, 7 rams, elaborate ritual arrangements formulated to generate optimal stipulations for otherworldly action. King Balak participates with frantic expectation that modified conditions could generate modified results, though the initial breakdown has disrupted his assurance in the complete venture. Again, Balaam retreats for isolated communication with celestial powers, again returns with communications that oppose his assignment and patron's anticipations. The subsequent favor demonstrates even more comprehensive than the initial, celebrating Hebrew capacity and celestial safeguarding with imagery extracted from existence's most powerful powers. "Ascend, Balak, and absorb. Attend to me, offspring of Zippor." The celestial is not a mortal that he ought to falsify, nor an offspring of humanity that he ought to modify his consciousness. Has he communicated, and will he not perform it? Or has he expressed, and will he not render it beneficial? Observe, I obtained a direction to favor. He has favored, and I cannot reverse it. The announcement persists with portrayals of Hebrew prosperity and celestial preference that render ridicule of Moabite expectations for otherworldly help against them. Every expression intensifies King Balak's mortification, while revealing the pointlessness of mortal strategies resistant to celestial intentions. The costly prophet hired to resolve Moab's predicament has transformed instead a channel for celebrating Hebrew benefits. Frantic irritation propels Balak toward a concluding undertaking at a third ritual location. Though his expressions disclose how thoroughly the prior breakdowns have deteriorated his assurance, "Kindly arrive. I will transport you to a different location. Maybe it will satisfy the celestial that you may condemn them for me from that place." The monarch's appeal recognizes that celestial intention instead of mortal procedure currently establishes results. Still, he cannot relinquish expectation for otherworldly action without relinquishing expectation for his realm's continuation. The third ceremony traces the identical elaborate designs. 7 sacrificial sites, burdensome sacrifices, ritual configurations formulated to maximize spiritual productivity. However, by this point, both contributors comprehend that their performing motions that celestial intention has previously established will break down to achieve their planned intentions. The activity has transformed ritual performance, executed more from despair than anticipation. Balaam's concluding declaration surpasses the prior favors in range and particularity, portraying Hebrew subsequent prosperity and armed achievement in expressions that straightforwardly endanger Moabite welfare. "How attractive are your dwellings, O Jacob, your residential locations, O offspring of Abraham, like lowlands that extend forward, like cultivated areas beside a waterway, like plants that the celestial has positioned, like cedar vegetation beside the currents. Hydration shall course from his containers, and his descendants shall be in numerous currents. His monarch shall be superior than Agag, and his realm shall be elevated. The favor terminates with guarantees of Hebrew armed supremacy over their adversaries, including particular reference of populations whose lands border Moabite territories. Every phrase propels forward the communication that otherworldly powers endorse Hebrew growth instead of resisting it. That celestial intentions incorporate Hebrew achievement at the sacrifice of present territorial authorities. King Balak's concluding reaction merges fury with acknowledgement that his costly strategy has broken down thoroughly. I requested you to condemn my adversaries, and observe, you have comprehensively favored them these 3 occasions. His rejection of the prophet holds bitter recognition that other worldly remedies to governmental difficulties stay subject to celestial instead of mortal authority. The 3 sacrificial sites descend cold as their flames consume toward ash and glowing remnants. The burdensome sacrifices have achieved nothing except revealing the pointlessness of resisting celestial intention through mortal strategies, however elaborate or costly. King Balak returns to his stronghold with vacant possessions and obscured expectations, while Balaam departs with recompense he did not acquire through assistance he could not supply. However, the breakdown of these condemning ceremonies achieves beyond what their achievement could have accomplished. The public revelation of celestial safeguarding for the Hebrew population reinforces their assurance while diminishing their adversaries' determination. The expressions communicated in undertaken condemnation transform declaration of favor that motivates Hebrew spirits and disturbs Moabite slumber. The 3 declarations resonate across the plateaus like atmospheric disturbance from unobstructed atmospheres, transporting communications that reorganize territorial comprehension of otherworldly actualities. A compensated prophet has transformed reluctant verification to celestial intentions that surpass mortal control, while costly ceremonies have disclosed the insufficiency of spiritual procedures resistant to celestial intention. Enticement at Shittim. Moab's concluding strategy functions. The Hebrew settlement at Shittim extends across the Jordan lowland like an enormous metropolis of fabric shelters. Its structured columns and precise arrangement mirroring the order that has maintained this population through periods of wilderness migration. At this place, within observation of the guaranteed territory that anticipates across the waterway, the offspring of Abraham rest and make ready for the concluding segment of their extended expedition toward the legacy their forefathers were guaranteed successive generations previously. The position holds tactical significance that reaches past its pragmatic benefits as a preparation zone for the Jordan passage. From Shittim, Hebrew reconnaissance can witness the strengthened urban centers of Canaan, while their authorities finalize arrangements for the conquest operations that will form them permanently in the territory, coursing with dairy and sweetness. The settlement vibrates with anticipation as a population who have experienced only wilderness make ready to obtain agricultural prosperity and metropolitan society. Still, this nearness to their aim additionally reveals the Hebrew population to attractions they haven't faced throughout their years of separation in the wilderness. The established populations of the territory observe Hebrew arrangements with expanding concern, pursuing methods to diminish or corrupt this impressive civilization before it commences obtaining lands presently under their authority. If straightforward armed clash seems pointless, maybe more refined methodologies could achieve what military forces and compensated prophets could not accomplish. The Moabites, affected from the mortification of Balaam's broken-down condemning ceremonies, demonstrated particularly inventive in formulating different approaches for managing the Hebrew danger. King Balak's counselors acknowledge that otherworldly safeguarding renders the Hebrew population nearly invulnerable to outside assault. But internal corruption could jeopardize that celestial preference in forms that foreign adversaries could manipulate. What comes forth from these strategic conversations demonstrates a complex grasp of human frailty and matters of the spirit. Instead of meeting Hebrew power head-on, the Moabite planners suggest eroding the ethical bedrock that sustains the Hebrew people's sacred bond with their guardian deity. Should the population be lured into conduct that breaks their sacred commitments, divine protection might be pulled away, rendering them exposed to more traditional methods of warfare. The tool selected for this campaign of moral erosion relies on tactics that have succeeded in comparable circumstances across the ages. Moabite women, chosen deliberately for their attractiveness and schooled in the techniques of enticement, start showing up in places where they'll cross paths with Hebrew men, beyond the watchful eyes of community leaders and kinship networks. These meetings seem random at the outset, natural encounters that grow organically into bonds of friendship and romance. The women participating in this operation receive guidance that shows thorough study of Hebrew spiritual customs and cultural foundations. They grasp which actions will most successfully undermine Hebrew sacred duties while appearing to provide authentic affection and fellowship. Their methods blend physical allure with psychological manipulation, forming connections that convince Hebrew men to abandon standards they would otherwise defend against outright assault. The spiritual aspect of this seduction effort proves especially destructive in how it affects Hebrew religious vitality. The Moabite women slowly bring their Hebrew partners into worship traditions linked to Baal of Peor, a Moabite god whose ceremonies contain features crafted to satisfy bodily desires and emotional hungers that wilderness existence has left mostly unfulfilled. The shift from intimate partnership to spiritual betrayal travels routes so delicate that numerous participants don't realize when they step across critical thresholds. Baal of Peor signifies something beyond merely another local god vying for Hebrew devotion. This deity represents spiritual concepts that stand in direct opposition to the covenant bond that has carried the Hebrew nation through their departure from Egypt and endurance in the barren lands. Where Hebrew belief requires undivided allegiance to the divine force that freed them from enslavement, Baal worship promotes split loyalty across numerous spiritual powers. Even more disturbing, Baal of Peor's ceremonial demands incorporate actions that break explicit moral laws essential to Hebrew sacred commitments. Temple prostitution, ceremonial intoxication, and ritual activities that glorify physical craving above spiritual self-control establish recurring patterns of covenant breaking that build up like toxin in Hebrew religious existence. The moral decay moves through the Hebrew settlement with the infectious speed that marks ethical compromise in societies where communal ties have weakened under extended hardship. Men who would have never contemplated deserting their inherited beliefs under ordinary conditions discover themselves slowly pulled into activities that at first seem innocent but eventually demand fundamental changes in spiritual devotion and ethical conduct. The sequence develops with the horrifying momentum of gradual surrender that has ruined civilizations throughout the ages. Individual Hebrew men, drawn initially by feminine charm and fellowship, find themselves offering small concessions to satisfy their new romantic interests. A communal dinner that contains food offered to foreign deities, showing up at religious celebrations that feel more like cultural gatherings than genuine worship, taking part in ceremonies framed as cultural exchanges instead of spiritual pledges. Each phase in this descent seems sensible when examined separately. Combined, however, they construct a trajectory that moves away from Hebrew sacred duties towards spiritual infidelity that endangers the very core of their collective identity. The women directing this seduction know precisely how to frame each fresh compromise as a logical continuation of what has already been tolerated, making opposition appear irrational or needlessly inflexible. The spiritual authorities who initially detect the expanding corruption confront difficulties that surpass their typical pastoral duties. Unlike outside dangers that bring Hebrew settlements together in shared resistance, this inner moral emergency splits households and clans as certain members adopt the novel religious activities while others push back with mounting distress. The very connections that have bound Hebrew culture together through generations of desert migration start to fracture under forces that set individual appetite against group responsibility. Moses gets word of the escalating emergency with the shocked understanding that divine protection for the Hebrew nation relies upon their loyalty to sacred commitments now being deliberately broken across the encampment. The afflictions that crushed Egypt, the miraculous supplies that kept them alive in the wasteland, the battlefield triumphs that opened their route toward the land of promise, all stem from divine blessing that demands total devotion to the authority that rescued them from slavery. The religious significance of the Shittim disaster reaches well beyond pressing worries about Hebrew battle preparedness or community unity. The seduction operation constitutes a frontal assault on the covenant bond that establishes Hebrew character and mission. Through tempting Hebrew men into the worship of Baal of Peor, Moabite planners attack the spiritual base that upholds everything unique about this nation's self-understanding and future purpose. Still, the brilliance of this offensive rests exactly in its roundabout method of gaining what head-on challenge could never secure. Instead of confronting Hebrew belief through religious debate or armed struggle, the Moabites corrupted through appeals to cravings and feelings that sacred duties are meant to channel and govern. The ensuing spiritual compromise seems to spring from Hebrew free will instead of outside force, rendering it more harmful to group morale and personal integrity. The celebration of Baal of Peor turns into the central point where hidden compromises combine into open rebellion that Hebrew leadership can no longer overlook or excuse. What started as personal connections between Hebrew men and Moabite women reaches its peak in collective involvement in worship rituals that clearly deny the singular demands of the deity who led them from Egypt. The spectacles that occur at these gatherings would shock Hebrew witnesses even without their spiritual ramifications. Temple prostitution degrades human intimacy to ceremonial transaction. Ritual drunkenness transforms worship into excessive celebration that honors appetite above discipline. Offering practices include gifts to entities that Hebrew teaching labels as evil deceptions, pretending to be sacred authorities. More crushing still is learning that Hebrew involvement in these rites includes people whose tribal standing and family ties render their apostasy especially offensive to community watchers. When the offspring of a tribal leader openly adopts Moabite worship customs, his conduct holds sway that reaches well past his individual decisions. When honored fighters and prosperous traders join in Baal worship, their participation implies that Hebrew sacred responsibilities might be cultural traditions instead of divine mandates. The emergency hits its peak when Zimri, a prominent figure from the Simeon tribe, escorts a Midianite woman named Cosbi straight into the Hebrew settlement in blatant disregard of Moses' leadership and covenant duties. This shameless display of public defiance happens right at the doorway to the meeting tent where Moses accepts divine messages, producing a deliberate clash between covenant fidelity and pagan temptation that calls for swift action. The spectacle of this brazen rebellion unfolding at the center of Hebrew spiritual existence sparks reactions that expose how profoundly the moral catastrophe has fractured the population. Certain Hebrew onlookers endorse Zimri's fearless claim of individual liberty over religious limitation. Others respond with shock at witnessing covenant responsibilities so openly broken in the actual presence of sacred holiness. The immobility that seizes Hebrew authority in this pivotal instant shows how thoroughly the seduction drive has weakened their moral standing and spiritual assurance. Divine wrath at this wholesale covenant breaking shows itself right away in a devastating illness that starts tearing through the Hebrew settlement with lethal speed. The divine shield that has kept the Hebrew population safe through decades of wilderness struggle abruptly lifts, rendering them defenseless against the sort of catastrophic sickness that can wipe out whole communities in mere days. The link between ethical betrayal and heavenly punishment turns undeniable as robust people start getting sick and perishing in figures that horrify the whole assembly. Yet even amid this disaster, divine compassion offers a route toward healing for anyone ready to select covenant loyalty over selfish longing. Phinehas, Aaron's descendant and thus part of the priestly bloodline charged with preserving Hebrew spiritual cleanness, moves with bold resolve that breaks through the moral freeze gripping his society. The spear thrust that kills both Zimri and Cosby signifies more than righteous fury at public betrayal. It shows the sort of absolute dedication to sacred duties that divine blessing demands from those who would assert position as chosen ones. Phinehas puts his personal safety and standing at risk to uphold spiritual standards that many Hebrew observers have started treating as flexible options instead of fixed demands. Heavenly endorsement of this forceful deed appears instantly in the halting of the plague that was wiping out Hebrew numbers. The divine punishment that risked annihilating the entire population ceases as abruptly as it commenced, proving that divine favor comes back when covenant faithfulness gets restored through leaders prepared to make difficult choices defending spiritual truth. The conclusion of the Shittim catastrophe leaves Hebrew culture cleansed, yet shaken by the awareness of how dangerously close they drifted toward losing everything through moral surrender that appeared enticing when pursued bit by bit, but turned catastrophic when its complete consequences grew obvious. The seduction that originated with individual romances had nearly obliterated their national character and divine shelter through a mechanism so refined that countless participants missed its spiritual weight until calamity hit. King Balak's last tactic against Hebrew growth eventually crumbles like all his earlier efforts, though not before inflicting harm that goes beyond what battlefield loss might have triggered. The Moabite seduction drive succeeds in exposing Hebrew weakness to corruption while displaying the awful price connected with covenant breaking. The population who proved immune to outside foes learn their openness to internal ethical rot that divine guardianship cannot stop without violating human liberty to pick obedience or defiance. The teachings absorbed at Shittim will resound through Hebrew awareness for coming ages, functioning as warning reminder that spiritual battle frequently proves more perilous than bodily conflict, that temptation can achieve what force cannot accomplish, that the supreme dangers to covenant peoples originate from inside instead of outside. The Moabite women who almost wrecked Hebrew fate through appeal to longing and hunger show how successfully adversaries can taint what they cannot defeat. Still, the emergency also discloses divine constancy that grants recovery for contrite souls, even following awful lapses of covenant dedication. The compassion that stops the plague when righteousness returns proves that divine care surpasses human breakdown, while never diminishing the sacredness that covenant bond necessitates. In outlasting the seduction at Shittim, the Hebrew population discovers both their susceptibility to enticement and their reach to pardon that enables restored loyalty. The consequences: retribution, cleansing, and a boundary established. The sunrise that appears over the Hebrew settlement, following the plague's quick end, unveils a population reshaped by their encounter with spiritual catastrophe. Where yesterday's shelters contained households participating in festivities of newly discovered wealth and coming inheritance, this morning's survivors navigate their everyday tasks with a grave consciousness of those who have seen divine judgment up close and grasped how barely they sidestepped total annihilation. Moses steps from the meeting tent, bearing the burden of divine revelation pressing upon his expression. The communication he has gathered during the dark hours holds directions that will transform Hebrew comprehension of their association with surrounding populations, especially those whose alluring power nearly wrecked their covenant character. The period for soft cautions and slow rectification has ended. What comes next will show the harshness needed when spiritual continuation hangs in the balance. The count commanded by heavenly decree unveils the total extent of injury caused by the Moabite seduction operation. 24,000 Hebrew souls claimed by the plague signifies more than simple death numbers. These were spouses and patriarchs, offspring and siblings, clan chiefs and talented artisans whose passing creates gaps in Hebrew civilization that will demand generations to mend. Every casualty sends shockwaves that affect households and settlements well past the direct sufferers. Still, the plague's casualties signify solely the most apparent results of spiritual decay that infected Hebrew culture during their stay at Shittim. The ethical rot that came before divine condemnation has carved deeper injuries in Hebrew awareness. Broken confidence among society members, uncertainties about leadership capability, questions about divine guardianship that previously felt total and unshakable. The cleansing ceremonies directed by Moses fulfill functions that go past ritual washing to tackle mental and spiritual wounds that follow awareness of shared moral breakdown. Hebrew people who considered themselves selected and shielded learn that divine preference holds duties they ignored at horrible expense. The ceremonies assist in working through sorrow while recommitting remaining society members to sacred commitments that latest happenings demonstrated were absolute. More difficult for Hebrew authority is the requirement to confront continuing bonds between Hebrew men and foreign women that persist regardless of the disastrous proof of where such links can go. The plague removed certain mixed unions through death, yet others continue as wellsprings of likely future decay that endanger fresh spiritual emergency. The choices demanded regarding these enduring connections challenge Hebrew resolve to position covenant responsibilities over individual wants. The heavenly guidance Moses gets concerning Moabite culpability for Hebrew spiritual near ruin holds meaning that stretches well past quick retribution toward lasting redrawing of connections between these two offshoots of Abraham's ancestral line. The seduction drive at Shittim violated limits that cannot be unviolated, damaged confidence that cannot be rebuilt, revealed hostility that eliminates future compromise or partnership. The armed operation commanded against Midianite partners who joined in the seduction plot fulfills both corrective and protective aims in Hebrew divine approach. Penalty for their participation in nearly destroying Hebrew covenant character through corrupt pressures. Protection against future comparable strikes through showing expenses linked with trying to lure Hebrew people from total devotion to their liberating God. The range and completeness of this armed reply startles even Hebrew watchers familiar with divine orders for absolute victory over adversaries. Every Midianite male encounters removal. Every wed woman meets their destiny. Solely unmarried females endure as living evidence of divine kindness that functions even inside settings of strict condemnation. The severity of these demands pushes Hebrew settlements to wrestle with moral intricacies that question easy beliefs about divine nature and human dignity. Balaam's end during this operation gives harsh ending to his tangled participation in Hebrew matters. The seer, who turned out powerless to hex them regardless of profitable contract from King Balak, seemingly kept pursuing methods to collect Moabite riches through backup plans for diminishing Hebrew spiritual opposition. His demise beside Midianite chiefs validates that divine guardianship reaches to removing dangers, whatever their supernatural claims or career standings. The riches captured during this corrective operation goes beyond anything Hebrew populations have formerly faced in their wasteland travels. Precious metals and currency, animals and fabrics, arms and instruments, valuable gems and rare substances. The prizes signify payment for spiritual shock, while supplying materials that will sustain Hebrew civilization during their shift from wandering to permanent existence beyond the Jordan. Still, the allocation of this prosperity following heavenly directions shows continuing worry for keeping spiritual cleanliness that lately proved so vulnerable to decay. The metal items that move through cleansing flame come out washed of links with pagan worship habits that rendered them spiritually hazardous. The thoughtful distribution guarantees that wealth obtained through judgment aids society, instead of personal concerns that could rebuild situations helpful to future moral surrender. The result of divine payback against Midianite seducers transmits obvious signals to other populations who could contemplate comparable approaches for diminishing Hebrew movement toward their guaranteed legacy. The destiny of those who try to spoil what they cannot vanquish functions as caution that divine guardianship for Hebrew populations includes vigorous removal of dangers to their spiritual wholeness. Area authorities must select adjustment or opposition, though seduction no longer stands as workable choice for managing Hebrew growth. King Balak watches these changes from his mountain stronghold with increasing awareness that every approach for blocking Hebrew victory has collapsed spectacularly. Armed clash proved pointless against divinely shielded adversaries. Purchased hexing changed into reluctant favor that boosted Hebrew certainty while disgracing Moabite self-regard. Seduction almost worked, but finally sparked divine condemnation that wiped out Hebrew decay while eliminating their opponents with thoroughness that went beyond standard battlefield conquest. The boundary marked in violence and flame surrounding Hebrew spiritual limits establishes lasting division between covenant populations and bordering kingdoms that goes beyond typical political or cultural differences. Coming associations will be shaped by acceptance of Hebrew divine assignment instead of customary arrangements of adjustment and shared sway. The Moabites and their supporters have discovered that trying to taint Hebrew covenant character holds expenses that surpass whatever advantages such tainting could offer. The Hebrew population who endured the emergency at Shittim bring forward teachings that will direct their method to foreign connections across their later record. The alluring strength of surrender, the awful expenses of spiritual disloyalty, the kindness accessible through repentance, and the shelter granted by unwavering dedication to sacred responsibilities. These realities turn into pieces of Hebrew shared recollection that shapes coming generations confronted with comparable enticements. The cleansing that comes after divine condemnation builds room for fresh spiritual development among Hebrew settlements that have been washed of tainting pressures through methods both agonizing and essential. The survivors grasp their weakness in methods that render them more instead of less reliant upon divine guardianship, more instead of less devoted to total covenant allegiance that nearly required everything yet finally proved their rescue. The change created by emergency and condemnation readies Hebrew populations for the tests waiting for them beyond the Jordan, where they will face enticements that overshadow anything encountered during their wasteland travels. The teachings absorbed through breakdown at Shittim turn into base for coming loyalty that will establish whether Hebrew settlement of their guaranteed legacy delivers favor or hex, triumph or disastrous collapse. As the Hebrew settlement readies for the closing stage of their trip toward heavenly guarantees accomplished, the result of Moabite seduction functions as turning instant that splits their chronicle into preceding and following groups that can never be merged or erased. The boundary, sketched by divine condemnation, builds limits that will establish Hebrew associations with nearby populations for coming ages, guaranteeing that the emergency at Shittim turns into warning account, whose teachings resound through ages like thunder moving across far-off peaks. The Moabites pull back to their uplands, bearing awareness that their most refined tactic for managing Hebrew growth not solely collapsed, but activated results that rendered Hebrew populations more, instead of less threatening, as area neighbors. The seduction that almost worked finally reinforced Hebrew spiritual barriers, while showing divine promise to shielding covenant populations from decay, whatever its origin or refinement. In the quiet that comes after condemnation, both populations ready for futures molded by this meeting in methods neither completely grasps. Yet, both will recall as the instant when short-term methods turned into lasting hostility, when spiritual battle displayed its genuine risks, when heavenly intentions showed their dominance over human plots, whatever their cleverness or despair. Deuteronomy's cautions Moab as emblem of decay. The sun hammers down on the flatlands of Moab. Moses stands facing the population, his speech traveling across the gathered clans. His statements slice through the wasteland atmosphere, bearing the mass of sacred order. This stands as his closing address, his final opportunity to caution them. The elderly seer's gaze blazes with recollection. He has witnessed what Moab can accomplish. The seduction at Shittim remains painful, like a fresh injury. 24,000 of his population collapsed because Moabite women guided them off course. At this moment, Moses speaks not merely of a kingdom, rather of a design, a method of reasoning that spoils from the core. Keep in mind what the Moabites inflicted upon you, Moses proclaims. His speech bounces off the close cliffs. The assembly pays attention with mounting strain. These aren't remote opponents, he references. Moab rests right beyond the waterway. Their meal fires become visible after dark. Yet Moses references something more profound than location. Moab transforms into an emblem in his statements. They signify the arrogance that declines to yield, the decay that assumes an attractive appearance, the defiance that labels itself intelligence. The descendants of Lot selected their route ages past. They might have been partners. They might have displayed kindness to their far-off relations. Rather, they contracted a seer to hex them. They dispatched their offspring to guide Israel's males from their God. Moses cautions against pursuing their goodwill. This directive baffles certain listeners. Why shut the entrance to alliance? Why decline to establish agreements? The response rests in what Moab signifies. Certain pressures cannot be corrected. Certain designs of reasoning poison all they contact. The caution reaches past governance into the domain of the soul. Moab represents the outlook that claims human intelligence exceeds sacred directive. Their civilization advances pleasure above standard. Their gods require what the genuine God prohibits. As Moses speaks, parents draw their youngsters nearer, patriarchs hold their weapons firmer. They start to comprehend. This isn't regarding despising populations. This concerns identifying toxin when you observe it. Certain springs appear pure, yet hold death in their lower reaches. The Moabite method of reasoning extends like yeast across dough. It begins minute, a surrender in this place, slight adaptability in that location. Shortly, the whole settlement has shifted. The limits that previously shielded them fall apart. Moses gestures beyond the waterway toward Moab's region. Those elevations conceal shrines to Chemosh. Those lowlands resound with ceremonies that cause the ground itself to protest. This becomes what occurs when a population selects their personal route above the method of their maker. The caution transforms into an instructional instrument. Coming ages will study these statements and absorb. When they confront their personal Moabs, they will recall. Certain entrances ought to remain sealed. Certain alliances expense excessively. The elderly seer's speech intensifies as he continues. Age has not reduced his dedication for reality. He has traveled with God for 80 years. He has observed wonders and condemnations. He grasps the contrast between kindness and recklessness. Moab possessed opportunities to select otherwise. When the Israelites requested protected travel, they might have agreed. When Balak contracted Balaam, they might have declined. When their offspring traveled to Shittim, they might have remained behind. Every selection guided them deeper from salvation. At this moment, they have transformed into something beyond a kingdom. They stand as a caution, a marker that states, "This route guides to obliteration." Their actual title will prompt God's population of what occurs when arrogance controls the soul. Moses completes his caution as the sun starts to drop. The wasteland becomes silent, aside from the noise of breeze across the settlement. The next day, they will traverse into the guaranteed territory. This evening, they recall the expense of surrender. The statements settle profoundly into the souls of those who listen. Moab could rest right beyond the waterway, yet they exist a realm distant in essence. The gap between favor and hex can be calculated not in distances, rather in the selections that mold a kingdom's character. Ruth the Moabite, a spark of salvation. The grain fields of Bethlehem extend amber beneath the daybreak radiance. A youthful woman travels among the columns of grain, her fingers collecting what others have abandoned. Her complexion holds the bronze of Moab's wasteland breezes. Her speech identifies her as an outsider. Still, something in her bearing references more profound matters. This stands as Ruth. Her account shatters the design like radiance across tempest vapors. For ages, the title Moab has signified difficulty for the population of Israel. Temptation, decay, and spiritual toxin have characterized their exchanges. At this moment arrives one who alters all. Ruth's path started in misfortune. Scarcity forced an Israelite household into Moab's region. Elimelech and Naomi transported their pair of offspring, pursuing nourishment. The territory accepted them, and the offspring discovered spouses among the native women. Ruth joined their home through union to Mahlon. Yet, death visited their residence with constant appetite. Initially, Elimelech perished, rendering Naomi a bereaved woman in an alien territory. Subsequently, her offspring accompanied their patriarch to the burial place. 3 women stayed, connected by sorrow and void. The coming years extended before them like a barren grain field. Naomi readied to go back to Bethlehem. Information indicated the scarcity had concluded. Her family member Orpah cried and went back to her population. This appeared sensible. Youthful women required households, shelter, prospect for youngsters. Moab presented these matters. Israel presented solely uncertainty. Ruth confronted the identical selection. Reasoning indicated remaining. Her population, her gods, her civilization, all waited in recognizable region. Naomi even pressed her to return. The elderly woman cherished her, yet observed no coming years for a Moabite bereaved woman in Bethlehem. Subsequently, Ruth voiced statements that resound across ages. Where you travel, I will travel. Where you remain, I will remain. Your population will become my population. Your God will become my God. The proclamation divides the atmosphere like thunder. A Moabite woman selects Israel's sacred bond above her personal legacy. This selection holds significance past individual sentiment. Ruth dismisses all Moab signifies. Their gods who require child offering transform into nothing to her. Their civilization of arrogance and defiance releases its grasp. She selects the more difficult route toward an uncertain coming time. The pair of women travel the powdery path toward Bethlehem alongside one another. Ruth's choice increases heavier with every pace. She abandons language, traditions, and the recognizable beat of Moabite existence. Forward waits a population who recalls Shittim, who hold cautions regarding Moabite decay. Bethlehem accepts them during grain collection. Ruth right away begins to labor in the grain fields. Hebrew regulation permits the needy to collect grain abandoned by collectors. She curves to collect fragments one grasp at a period. Her spine hurts beneath the radiance, yet her essence remains powerful. Fortune directs her paces to the grain field of Boaz. This prosperous property holder observes the foreign woman laboring among his workers. Her effort affects him. Her devotion to Naomi touches him. Her selection to pursue Israel's God reshapes his perspective of what a Moabite could transform into. Ruth's nature radiates across everyday movement. She labors intensely without objection. She tends for Naomi with constant commitment. She displays regard for traditions. She remains absorbing. The settlement starts to observe past her foreign origin to the soul inside. Naomi identifies God's influence in these happenings. She directs Ruth in the traditions of family rescuer. Should Boaz acknowledge the position, he can rebuild their household lineage. Ruth must reach him following Hebrew custom. Another selection between ease and dedication waits. Ruth pursues Naomi's instruction with silent resolve. She reaches Boaz at the grain's separating location. Her appeal for shelter holds more profound significance. She requests him to shield her with his covering, utilizing the identical term that portrays God's shielding attention. Boaz replies with happiness and respect. He commends Ruth's devotion to Naomi. He acknowledges her selection of Israel's God above Moab's gods. He observes in her the sort of soul that reshapes kingdoms. Their union transforms into an emblem of salvation reaching past clan limits. Their offspring Obed delivers happiness to Naomi's later years. The women of Bethlehem honor the youngster who will rebuild their companion's legacy. They state that Ruth cherishes Naomi superior to 7 offspring. The foreign family member transforms into a wellspring of favor. Still, the account extends even more distant. Obed fathers Jesse, Jesse fathers David. The Moabite woman's selection sends waves across ages until it touches the position of Israel. The family line, that previously appeared hexed at this moment, bears the royal guarantee. Ruth's change references possibilities that appear unattainable. Moab, the emblem of decay, produces Ruth, the foremother of monarchs. The kingdom that lured Israel at Shittim at this moment adds to Israel's supreme royal line. Kindness composes fresh accounts in the borders of condemnation. David against Moab. Condemnation comes back. The bronze radiates in David's grasp as he considers the blade. Surrounding him, Moabite captives kneel in extended columns across the combat ground. The monarch's expression displays no feeling, yet his gaze holds the mass of righteousness, extended, postponed. This isn't payback. This stands as something more profound. The daybreak atmosphere still bears smoke from the blazing settlements. David's forces have moved across Moab like a purifying blaze. Strongholds that existed for ages at this moment rest in wreckage. The population who previously contracted Balaam to hex Israel at this moment sample the harsh outcome of that ancient choice. David's link to this territory travels across intricate passages. His great ancestress, Ruth, originated from these elevations. Her selection to pursue Israel's God altered the path of Chronicle. Still, that individual connection does not halt his grasp. Certain obligations go beyond household connections. The assessment cord extends across the earth, splitting the captives into clusters. 2 segments kneel in the powder, aware of their destiny. 1 segment stays upright, permitted existence through David's kindness. The arrangement appears severe to present outlooks, yet it pursues the ancient principle of heavenly condemnation. Moab's offense extends backward across ages like roots of a toxic plant. They declined travel to Israel during the barren years. They contracted a seer to hex selected populations. Their women guided 24,000 Israelites into spiritual disloyalty at Shittim. Every violation contributed mass to the measurement of righteousness. The present operation started with Moabite hostility. Monarch Mesha of Moab had delivered payment to Israel during Saul's rule. Yet David's climb to authority enticed him toward defiance. He assumed the youthful monarch would remain excessively occupied, solidifying authority to reply to Moabite freedom. He measured inadequately. David's standing went before his forces into Moabite region. The shepherd youth who confronted Goliath at this moment directed the most dreaded armed strength in the area. His strategic brilliance, merged with heavenly blessing, rendered opposition pointless. Settlement following settlement collapsed, facing the moving Israelite strength. The Moabite forces attempted to establish a position at their ancient stronghold of Kir Hareseth. The enormous barriers had shielded them for ages. Their god Chemosh supposedly favored the fortress with divine strength. Yet human barriers cannot endure against heavenly condemnation when the period arrives. David's attack machines hammered the entryways, while his archers filled the atmosphere with projectiles. The protectors battled courageously, yet confronted unattainable circumstances. When the barriers finally split, the flood of Israelite fighters flowed across like water across a fractured barrier. The result demanded thoughtful management. David could not merely pull back following such triumph. Moab required to grasp that their defiance held lasting results. The assessment cords functioned as both condemnation and instructional instrument for other kingdoms watching from range. Certain endured to transport the signal backward to their dispersed settlements. Moab would persist as a population, yet never once more as a substantial authority. Their sway would reduce to the limits they could successfully protect. The periods of endangering Israel were completed. The precious metals and currency from Moabite temples stream into David's holdings. These valuables will assist constructing the temple his offspring will build in Jerusalem. Even Moab's prosperity fulfills God's aims in the conclusion. Nothing gets squandered in the system of heavenly righteousness. Chemosh, the god of Moab, stays quiet across the obliteration. His spiritual leaders present frantic offerings, yet no divine action arrives. The difference with Israel's God turns obvious. When heavenly blessing changes, human authority falls apart, like sand structures facing the wave. Information of David's triumph extends across the nearby kingdoms. The Ammonites and Philistines observe. Defiance against Israel at this moment holds a price none can manage to deliver. David's standing as God's selected monarch expands with every armed achievement. The operation also provides warning to Israel's personal population. Loyalty delivers favor, yet disobedience invites condemnation. The identical God who obliterated Moab for their offenses will not accept decay in his selected kingdom. David's triumphs arrive with duty for preserving righteousness. Years afterward, when David's personal household confronts results for his ethical breakdowns, the monarch will recall this period. The assessment cord that split Moabite captives predicts the splits that will tear his home apart. Righteousness slices both methods in God's system. The enduring ones go back to rebuild what stays of their settlements. They recall the period when David's bronze blade mirrored the daybreak radiance. They instruct their youngsters regarding the expense of challenging God's selected one. The teaching settles profoundly into Moabite awareness. Moab's authority is fractured, yet their account persists. They will create pottery and exchange materials. They will establish households and manage animals. Yet they will never once more endanger Israel's protection or guide God's population into offense. The section of Moabite hostility shuts with David's forceful triumph. Solomon's surrender. Moabite spouses and the descending root. The royal estate gardens flower with rare blooms from far-off territories. Solomon travels among them as the daybreak radiance passes across Lebanese timber. His spouses join him, women whose attractiveness corresponds the magnificence of his realm. Among them travels an offspring of Moab, her ornaments catching the radiance like seized flame. Intelligence constructed this realm, yet intelligence at this moment confronts its supreme challenge. Solomon's soul, previously wholly committed to Israel's God, has started to split like a waterway dividing surrounding stones. The individual who requested comprehension at this moment battles to comprehend himself. The union started as governance. Moab remained holding tactical region along Israel's eastern limit. A royal wedding might obtain calm superior to whatever agreement. Solomon's counselors commended the governance intelligence. The offspring of Moab transported not merely attractiveness, rather valuable links to exchange paths. Still, governance estimation unlocked an entrance that ought to have stayed sealed. Moses had cautioned against pursuing calm with Moab. David had shown why across armed victory. At this moment, Solomon chases the actual association his forefathers prevented. The Moabite royal woman comes with a splendid gift. Pack animals transport valuables from the eastern wasteland. Workers transport fragrances, valuable stones, and golden decorations that compete Egypt's finest skill. The wedding celebration extends for periods, pulling representatives from far-off realms. Affection develops between the monarch and his fresh spouse. Her intelligence corresponds, her attractiveness. She voices multiple languages and grasps the intricate governance of worldwide exchange. Solomon appreciates their discussions regarding thinking, expression, and the supervision of realms. Yet affection transforms into the route for more profound surrender. The royal woman follows the faith of her patriarchs. She venerates Chemosh, the god who requires youngsters be moved across flame. She keeps home shrines where incense blazes daily to Moabite gods. Initially, Solomon displays solely courteous concern in her spiritual observations. He constructed the temple for Israel's God and remains presenting the demanded offerings. His commitment appears protected. Still, interest starts to weaken conviction, as certainly as water eroding stone. The royal woman clarifies her gods with devoted expression. Chemosh controls battle and triumph. Astarte delivers abundance to harvests and fertility. Every god possesses a domain of sway that supplements the others. Why restrict oneself to merely one god when numerous present assistants? Solomon starts to participate in her spiritual rites, not as a worshipper, rather as a spouse displaying regard for his spouse's customs. He informs himself this shows governance, intelligence. Worldwide unions demand cultural awareness. Certainly, God grasps these requirements. The initial shrine constructed beyond Jerusalem appears innocent adequately. A minute shrine on an elevation where his spouse can venerate following her traditions. Solomon supplies the substances, yet doesn't join straight. He keeps the illusion that his personal belief stays untainted. Additional foreign spouses observe this adjustment and appeal for comparable advantages. The Ammonite royal woman desires a shrine for Molech. The Sidonian woman seeks a location to respect Astarte. Shortly, the elevations surrounding Jerusalem develop shrines like fungus following moisture. The contradiction increases substantial with period. Solomon constructed the most magnificent temple in Israel's chronicle for the veneration of the singular, genuine God. At this moment, he supports construction efforts for the actual gods. Israel received orders to dismiss. The difference avoids his observation as steady alteration blinds him. The monarch's commitment changes by amounts excessively minute to calculate daily. He remains participating in temple functions, yet with reduced frequency. He remains presenting offerings, yet with reduced passion. The blazing dedication for God's regulation cools to lukewarm observation. Younger spiritual leaders observe the alteration before the elder ones recognize it. They observe how the monarch's focus drifts during sacred readings. They notice his mounting absence from sacred celebrations. They murmur among themselves regarding the orientation of Solomon's soul. The citizens mirror the conduct of their monarch, as has always been the case throughout history. When Solomon makes room for gods from foreign lands, what reason do ordinary people have to maintain strict devotion to one deity alone? The protective barriers that once safeguarded Israel's unique spiritual character start to fade and weaken. Traders making their way to the hilltop worship sites discover these locations serve well for commercial transactions. Visiting merchants from distant lands feel at ease in a territory that respects their divine beings alongside the god of the region. Trade and business thrive, though few perceive the price being paid. The decay spreads gradually, working its way through the spiritual framework that supports Israel. The younger generation comes of age, viewing multiple places of worship as perfectly ordinary. Young men take foreign brides without pausing to consider what this means for their faith. The nation that once maintained clear separation from surrounding peoples now merges into the religious backdrop of the entire region. Solomon's final years usher in growing shadows and difficulties. The exceptional insight that once left visiting royalty in awe proves insufficient to untangle the problems his compromises have generated. The kingdom starts to splinter as various factions chase their individual ambitions rather than maintaining national cohesion. The Moabite princess grows older with dignity within her palace quarters. Her deity, Chemosh, continues to receive steady offerings funded by the royal coffers. She has achieved what her forebears could not through hiring Balaam or dispatching seductresses to him. She has infected Israel's most magnificent king from inside his very household. Even for kings who were once beloved, God's tolerance has boundaries. The supernatural blessing that lifted Solomon to greatness starts pulling back like ocean waters, retreating from the beach. Israel's golden era under this king will not outlast the spiritual betrayal of its architect, Chemosh, Moab's dark deity. The place of sacrifice rises black against the deep red evening sky. Vapor ascends from its surface, bringing the sharp, bitter scent of burned sacrifices up toward the stars scattered across the desert. The screams of young ones reverberate against the stone barriers as clergy wearing robes marked with blood recite verses in languages passed down through ages. This represents the veneration of Chemosh, and it requires the most terrible payment imaginable. Chemosh governs Moab through intimidation cloaked in sacred ceremony. His designation translates to destroyer in the ancient language, and those who follow him think that destruction makes way for fresh beginnings. They present their most valued treasures to gain his approval, holding the conviction that what they sacrifice returns to them multiplied as blessing. The statue representing this god looms above those gathered to worship, hewn from dark stone that appears to swallow light instead of casting it back. His countenance combines human and animal characteristics, with eyes that burn like hot coals in the dimness. His extended limbs terminate in bronze containers, where sacrifices smolder without ceasing, day after day and night after night. Evidence uncovered by archaeologists at ancient Moabite locations shows how extensively Chemosh was worshipped across their lands. Stone platforms for offerings mark elevated places stretching from the Dead Sea across to the Arnon River. Clay containers display his emblem, a flame design rising from hands held together in a cup shape. This god's reach penetrated every dimension of how Moabite society functioned. Chemosh requires demonstrations of loyalty that other deities do not demand. Soldiers present imprisoned foes on his platforms prior to engaging in combat. Those who work the land sacrifice the first of their newborn sheep when planting season arrives. However, the god's deepest craving focuses on the young, particularly the sons and daughters belonging to his most committed adherents. The custom appalls the peoples living nearby. Nevertheless, Moabites view it as the supreme expression of devotion. They hold the belief that Chemosh draws strength from the vital energy of those without guilt, becoming more powerful with every life given. Mothers and fathers who surrender their offspring to the fire are honored as the most dedicated servants their god possesses. The ceremony adheres to ancient sequences handed down across generations. Religious officials heat the bronze limbs of the image until they radiate crimson in the dark. Percussion instruments pound out patterns that echo the rhythm of hearts beating. Those assembled speak prayers in unison, their voices rising in force as the ritual approaches its peak. Women carry their babies forward with moisture streaming from their eyes. They maintain the conviction that this offering guarantees their remaining children will enjoy lengthy lives. Men suppress their grief as they position their boys upon the heated bronze, certain that Chemosh will deliver triumph in warfare. The theological structure that upholds these customs shows a perspective on existence that stands fundamentally against Israel's comprehension of what is divine. Chemosh embodies disorder that requires constant feeding to avoid even worse devastation. Those devoted to him exist in terror of what consequences might arrive should they neglect to satisfy his appetite. This creates a striking opposition to Israel's God, who supplies lambs for offerings and prevents Abraham's hand from bringing down the blade when he prepares to sacrifice Isaac. In the place where Chemosh consumes children, the Lord of Israel shields them from harm. Where the god of Moab calls for death, Israel's God extends life. The Moabite inscription unearthed in recent times preserves King Mesh's declaration about his commitment to Chemosh. The carved words tell how this monarch presented his firstborn son to obtain victory against Israel. The practice persisted at the very top levels of Moabite civilization throughout the span of their existence. The worship of Chemosh incorporates fertility ceremonies that resemble customs discovered throughout the ancient Near Eastern world. Temple prostitutes function as channels for supernatural power, their physical forms becoming platforms where those seeking favor attempt to gain blessing. These observances erase the distinction between sacred devotion and physical pleasure. The religious officials of this god possess tremendous political influence within Moabite culture. They manage temple vaults overflowing with precious metals from worshippers expressing gratitude. They provide counsel to monarchs regarding questions of warfare and diplomacy. They read signs and forecast what lies ahead by examining the remains of sacrifices. Still, despite all their authority, the priests of Chemosh prove unable to save their nation from ultimate ruin. When the military forces of Nebuchadnezzar march through the territory, the god offers no response. The platforms that previously blazed with constant offerings turn frigid and vacant. The one who destroys meets his own destruction. The reach of Chemosh spreads past Moab's territorial limits through commercial exchange and marriages between nations. Solomon's wives from foreign kingdoms introduced these customs into the royal establishment of Israel. The contamination moves like toxin through the spiritual circulatory system of the nation, diminishing their bond with the authentic God. Contemporary discoveries through archaeology keep revealing how widespread the worship of Chemosh was across the ancient world. Tablets made of clay detail ceremonies in various tongues. Images painted in burial chambers portray rituals that verify biblical descriptions of Moabite religious behavior. The belief system surrounding child sacrifice fulfills various psychological requirements within Moabite civilization. It shows absolute dedication to their deity. It transforms parental sorrow into something holding spiritual significance. It strengthens communal ties through collective participation in horror and shared responsibility. Beyond this, the practice operates as a method for managing population numbers during periods when resources become limited. When nourishment grows scarce, presenting children to Chemosh eliminates those needing to be fed while supplying sacred reasoning for choices that would otherwise be unbearable. Survival intertwines with spiritual practice in catastrophic fashion. Within biblical writings, Chemosh signifies more than simply a god from another land. He represents the idea that people must purchase divine approval through actions that grow increasingly severe. This generates a competition in spiritual matters, where the sacrifice offered yesterday fails to meet tomorrow's requirements. The god's fundamental shortcoming resides not in his brutality, but rather in his failure to bring satisfaction to the spirits of those who serve him. No quantity of sacrifice produces enduring tranquility. No gift secures protection that lasts. The followers of Chemosh dwell in perpetual anxiety that their offerings have fallen short. The prophets raise their voices, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and the downfall of Moab. The holy messenger stands atop Jerusalem's defensive wall as the first light of day appears over the mountains to the east. His voice travels across the urban center like the rumble of thunder descending from the heavens. Isaiah addresses not merely Israel, but every nation that imagines they can avoid divine accountability. His declarations regarding Moab cut through the air of early morning with the accuracy of a surgeon's instrument. The pronouncement about Moab, Isaiah commences, his vocal quality weighted with both grief and absolute certainty. What comes next is not rage, but mourning for a people who selected their own annihilation. The prophet sheds tears even while announcing what is coming, because he perceives the conclusion of events before their occurrence. Isaiah's supernatural sight discloses Moab's approaching destruction in striking particulars. Urban centers will collapse within a single period of darkness. Fortified positions that have endured for hundreds of years will disintegrate like structures made of sand. The population will abandon their dwellings, taking with them whatever they managed to rescue from the ruins of their way of life. The prophet portrays refugees flowing toward Zoar, the identical settlement where Lot sought safety from the devastation of Sodom. The parallel is intentional rather than accidental. Moab's narrative completes its arc as these descendants make their way back to the location where their ancestors found refuge. Physical landscape transforms into spiritual teaching when spoken by the prophet's voice. Yet Isaiah's message holds more than predictions of military defeat. He observes the spiritual aspects of Moab's downfall. Their god, Chemosh, will be transported into captivity alongside those who venerated him. The deity, who extracted such heavy tribute, will demonstrate complete powerlessness to rescue those who gave him service. The prophet's language unveils God's emotional response, even within the context of judgment. "My heart mourns for Moab," Isaiah proclaims. Divine justice provides no satisfaction when it descends upon human beings fashioned in God's likeness. Even rebellious Moab merits lamentation when they encounter destruction. In the years that follow, Jeremiah assumes the prophetic responsibility. His oracle, directed at Moab, builds upon Isaiah's message while introducing additional layers. The prophet, known for weeping, sees not simply political disintegration, but the termination of Moab's complete manner of existence. Their cultural identity will disperse like foliage blown by winds of autumn. Jeremiah identifies Moab's arrogance as the source of their ruin. They placed confidence in their defensive structures, their material prosperity, and their god Chemosh. However, human achievements crumble to nothing when divine forbearance reaches its conclusion. The prophet issues warning that no place of safety can conceal what God has resolved to bring under judgment. The prophecy contains a haunting picture of Moab as a shattered vessel. Previously useful for holding items of value, the container now rests broken beyond any possibility of repair. The comparison captures both the irreversible nature of judgment and the squandering of what could have been possible. Nevertheless, even the severe words spoken by Jeremiah include suggestions of compassion. In the days far ahead, God will reverse Moab's misfortunes. The judgment does not represent the final chapter of their account, but rather a painful section in an extended narrative leading toward redemption. Hope glimmers even within the bleakest prophecies. Amos examines Moab's transgression from yet another perspective. The prophet, who worked as a shepherd, concentrates on their actions toward Edom's monarch, whose skeletal remains they incinerated to produce lime. This violation of human remains breaks the fundamental respect owed to all persons, without regard to which nation they belong to. The offense reveals Moab's true nature more transparently than their religious observances. They will pursue any action to disgrace their adversaries, including profaning corpses to manufacture construction supplies. Such mercilessness shows the distance they have traveled from God's design for human conduct. Amos declares that Moab's king will perish in the judgment that approaches. The royal bloodline that employed Balaam and dispatched seductresses to Shittim will at last experience repercussions for their deeds. Divine justice may progress slowly, but its arrival is inevitable. The prophetic messages against Moab fulfill various functions within Israel's spiritual formation. They prove God's authority extends over every nation, not exclusively the people of the covenant. They reveal that ethical principles apply to all humanity, without exception, based on religious allegiance. The oracles additionally caution Israel regarding the outcomes of embracing Moabite customs. If God will bring judgment upon Moab for sacrificing children and practicing sexual perversion, he will certainly judge his selected people should they adopt identical transgressions. Divine preference does not provide exemption from moral responsibility. The artistic quality of these prophecies merits recognition alongside their theological substance. Isaiah employs plays on words that link Moab's designation with lamentation. Jeremiah uses comparisons that create vivid pictures in the mind of the listener. Amos presents his message with the straightforwardness of someone who tends livestock calling to his animals. Historical documentation validates the precision of these prophetic cautions. Chronicles from Assyria and Babylon describe military operations against Moab that align with the biblical accounts. The archaeological evidence displays destruction layers that match the time periods referenced by the prophets. The emotional quality of the oracles discloses something significant about God's character. Justice brings no pleasure when it necessitates human anguish. The prophets weep while speaking because they mirror the heart of their master. Even judgment that proves necessary carries a burden. Moab's reaction to these warnings follows an entirely predictable course. They reject the prophets as foreign agitators creating trouble. They rely upon their military capability and political partnerships. They persist in worshipping Chemosh and anticipating his defense. Arrogance prevents them from seeing the danger drawing near. The realization of these prophecies confirms the genuineness of biblical revelation. When words spoken by humans demonstrate accuracy regarding future happenings, they prove their divine source. The collapse of Moab transforms into proof that God truly communicates through his selected messengers. The prophetic tradition extends beyond the particular pronouncements against Moab. Writers in later periods employ these judgments as illustrations of divine justice in operation. The concepts established through Moab's judgment extend to every nation across all time periods. Nebuchadnezzar and the collapse of Moab. The cloud of dust visible on the distant horizon expands in size with each passing day. Moabite sentries push their vision to its limits against the brilliant desert light, wishing desperately the information they received proves false. However, the proof accumulates with every hour that passes. The war apparatus of Babylon advances toward them like a deluge nothing can halt. The fearsome reputation of Nebuchadnezzar arrives before his military forces. Jerusalem sits in devastation in his wake. Egypt shakes at the mere speaking of his designation. The lesser nations throughout the region have discovered they must either yield or suffer complete annihilation. At this moment, Moab faces the choice between continuing to exist and preserving their pride. King Jehoiakim of Moab summons his advisors to gather in the ancient stronghold of Kir-Hareseth. The enormous defensive walls have provided protection for successive generations. Surely these fortifications can resist whatever force approaches from the western direction. The god Chemosh has never abandoned them in moments of emergency. The discussions extend through the hours of darkness. Certain counselors recommend surrendering without delay. They reference the destiny of other nations that opposed Babylon's progression. Others press for resistance, trusting in their familiarity with desert conditions and advantageous defensive locations. Arrogance contends against wisdom within the royal assembly. Couriers arrive at frequent intervals, bringing updates regarding the army drawing closer. The reported numbers exceed what seems believable. Foot soldiers extend across the horizon, resembling a dark ocean. Siege machinery advances on wheels that cause the earth to tremble for great distances in all directions. This represents not a raid for plunder, but a systematic operation of total destruction. Chemosh receives frantic offerings as the emergency intensifies. The priests ignite incense until the temple becomes filled with scented vapor. Children weep as their parents raise them in the direction of the bronze limbs of their deity. Certainly, such commitment will inspire the destroyer to intervene for their benefit. Yet the platforms remain without response, as Babylonian observers materialize on far ridges. No supernatural rescue appears to deliver the people who have devoted themselves to Chemosh across centuries. The god who required so much from them shows himself unable to act when his adherents require him in their most desperate hour. The siege methods employed by Nebuchadnezzar follow established procedures refined through earlier operations. His specialists examine the landscape and locate vulnerable points in Moab's protective systems. Earthen constructions rise like mountains formed with geometric precision surrounding each city marked for attack. The deliberate methodology communicates complete assurance regarding the final result. The initial assaults concentrate on smaller communities along the edges of Moabite territory. These settlements surrender within a matter of days, their residents either killed or taken captive. Columns of smoke indicate the positions of villages consumed by fire. Those fleeing stream toward the larger population centers, bringing accounts of Babylonian effectiveness and devastation. Kir Hareseth becomes the center point of Moabite opposition. The fortress, dating to ancient times, has never succumbed to foreign invasion. Its protective barriers ascend from foundations of solid rock, appearing impossible to breach. Those defending believe geography will accomplish what their god cannot. The siege engines of Babylon commence their labor with mechanical exactness. Battering devices pound against the gates, while throwing machines hurl massive stones at the walls. The noise reverberates through the desert like continuous thunder that never concludes. Without interruption, day and night, the bombardment proceeds. Within the settlement, provisions diminish as the encirclement grows tighter. Reservoirs for collecting water drain away, while stores of food dwindle. Young ones cry from emptiness in their bellies, while their parents distribute the grain that remains in careful portions. The defenders, filled with pride, begin comprehending what defeat truly signifies. The clergy of Chemosh present increasingly frantic offerings to obtain divine interference. The bronze limbs of their deity radiate red heat from unceasing use. Still, the walls keep crumbling under the Babylonian assault. Belief struggles against the testimony of what their eyes perceive. An opening finally appears in the fortifications that stood for ages. Babylonian warriors surge through the opening like liquid through a ruptured barrier. The defenders battle with courage, but confront odds that cannot be overcome. One street after another, the city surrenders to the enemy pressing forward. King Jehoiakim establishes his final position within the temple of Chemosh. Encircled by the guards who remain, he appeals to his god for deliverance through miracle. However, the bronze image stands without speech as Babylonian forces invade the sacred area. The monarch meets his end beside the platform where he presented his children as offerings. The surrender of Kir Hareseth indicates the conclusion of organized Moabite resistance. Smaller population centers submit rather than endure comparable destruction. The nation that previously employed prophets to pronounce curses on Israel now pleads for clemency from those who conquered them. The manner in which Nebuchadnezzar handles defeated Moab adheres to established procedures. The prominent citizens begin their march toward Babylonian captivity. Workers possessing specialized skills become part of the labor force, constructing projects in cities far away. The territory lies available for occupation by populations more willing to cooperate. The valuables from Chemosh's temple join Babylon's extensive accumulated wealth. Golden containers become part of the plunder seized from Jerusalem's temple. The possessions of the destroyer god now serve foreign rulers in lands not his own. Irony brings the circle of divine judgment to completion. Moabite civilization begins its ultimate dissolution as families scatter throughout the Babylonian Empire. Children mature speaking Aramaic rather than the language of their forebears. Ancient traditions fade as new generations adjust to foreign customs. The sense of identity that defined their people across centuries gradually vanishes. Evidence from archaeology confirms how thoroughly Babylonian forces destroyed sites across Moabite lands. Layers showing fire damage mark the termination of settlements from the Iron Age. Pottery designs shift abruptly as new populations take over the locations left vacant. The physical record supports the biblical narrative. Certain Moabites succeeded in escaping the destruction by fleeing into the Arabian wilderness. These refugees preserve fragments of their culture within dispersed tribal communities, but they never again form into a unified nation with capability to menace their neighbors. The absence of any response from Chemosh during Moab's time of crisis exposes the hollowness of false devotion. All the children consumed on his platforms purchase no defense when judgment makes its arrival. The God who gave assurances of victory provides only defeat. Divine pretense dissolves before divine actuality. The conquest of Moab by Nebuchadnezzar brings to pass the prophetic warnings spoken generations before. Isaiah's oracle demonstrates accuracy in every particular. The predictions made by Jeremiah occur precisely as recorded in writing. The downfall confirms the reliability of biblical prophecy. The spirit of Moab reverberates in the New Testament. The sun descends below the horizon over the Jordan River as Jesus walks beside its flowing waters. Somewhere beyond those waters rest the remnants of ancient Moab, their cities having long since dissolved to particles of dust. Nevertheless, the spiritual instruction embedded within their account continues, reverberating across the ages like sounds transported on desert breezes. Jesus, in his documented ministry, never references Moab by name directly, yet the configurations they exemplify surface throughout his work. The arrogance that brings ruin, the temptation that leads to corruption, the defiance that presents itself as virtue. These motifs emerge repeatedly as he confronts the religious authorities of his era. The Pharisees display Moabite pride through their presumption that human tradition holds greater weight than divine instruction. Like those descended from Lot, they place confidence in their own understanding rather than yielding to God's disclosed intention. Their meticulous attention to ritual conceals the identical spiritual rebellion that previously prompted Moab to employ Balaam. When Jesus purifies the temple, he addresses the same contamination that infected Israel through Moabite contact. Those exchanging currency transform sacred territory into commercial venue. Religious authorities extract profit from the devotion of those making pilgrimage. The structure designated for prayer transforms into a gathering place for thieves, calling to mind the spiritual unfaithfulness that commenced at Shittim. The Apostle Paul establishes explicit links between warnings from the Old Testament and realities in the New Testament. Composing his letter to the Corinthians, he cites the seduction at Baal Peor as caution against sexual wrongdoing. The identical desires that destroyed 24,000 Israelites pose danger to believers in every generation. The description Paul provides of deceptive teachers reflects the ancient Moabite approach of spiritual enticement. They offer promises of liberty while providing enslavement. They speak regarding enlightenment while distributing obscurity. They assert they bring life while trafficking in mortality. The techniques evolve, but the fundamental deception persists unchanged. The Book of Revelation holds imagery that brings to mind Moab's final destiny. Babylon the Great collapses with a sound that reverberates through both heaven and earth. The woman who enticed monarchs confronts ultimate judgment for her spiritual unfaithfulness. The configuration established through Moab's destruction discovers its universal completion. Peter issues warnings to believers regarding false prophets who will emerge from within the church community itself. These instructors parallel Balaam, employed to pronounce curses but constrained to speak blessings. They desire the compensation of wickedness while articulating words that appear spiritual in nature. The Moabite tactic of corruption from inside the community persists in fresh manifestations. The brief letter from Jude holds one of the most explicit New Testament references to this ancient account. He cautions against individuals who have followed the path of Balaam through selling spiritual abilities for material benefit. The prophet who proved unable to curse Israel transforms into a representation of religious corruption throughout the history of the church. The genealogy tracing Jesus contains a remarkable reminder of God's mercy toward the nations. Ruth, the Moabite woman, appears within the royal ancestry, demonstrating that divine compassion can reshape even the most improbable individuals. The woman who selected Israel's God in place of the deities of Moab becomes a foremother of the Messiah. This incorporation functions as a compelling counterbalance to the general condemnation of Moab. Personal decision can supersede national fate. Individual trust can overcome inherited configurations. The account of Ruth proves that no person exists outside the range of redemption. Jesus, in his own person, represents the complete response to Moab's spiritual difficulty. In the place where Chemosh required the sacrifice of children, Christ presents himself as the ultimate offering. Where Moabite devotion encouraged terror and doubt, the good news delivers tranquility and confidence. The authentic God supplies what the counterfeit deities could never provide. The parable describing the persistent widow holds reflections of Moab's connection with justice. Unlike the dishonest magistrate who requires persistent pestering before taking action, God takes pleasure in defending his people. The distinction emphasizes the difference between human arrangements that can be influenced through manipulation and divine justice that springs from flawless character. The missionary travels of Paul carry him through territories previously shaped by Moabite civilization. The good news penetrates regions where Chemosh previously maintained dominance. Communities of believers emerge in territories where young ones previously burned on bronze platforms. Illumination drives away obscurity in locations that appeared eternally shadowed. The transformation of the Ethiopian official provides a wonderful parallel to the transformation of Ruth. Like the Moabite woman, this foreign dignitary selects to follow Israel's God despite his position as an outsider. Philip's clarification of Isaiah's prophecy opens possibilities that appeared permanently sealed to participation by Gentiles. Writers from early Christian periods perceived in Moab's account a preview of the church's conflict against corruption from worldly sources. The seduction at Shittim transformed into a caution regarding the perils of making compromises with beliefs outside the faith. The collapse of Kir Hareseth demonstrated what occurs when divine protection withdraws. The Book of Acts portrays how the good news extends to the farthest reaches of the earth, encompassing regions previously dominated by Moab's sway. The Great Commission reverses the ancient configuration of Israel being corrupted through foreign nations. At this time, Israel's Messiah transforms the nations through those who follow him. Contemporary discoveries through archaeology in Jordan keep uncovering links between biblical accounts and historical actuality. Christian pilgrims make visits to locations connected with Moses' closing address and the hometown of Ruth. The physical terrain preserves recollections that deepen New Testament comprehension. The theological ramifications of Moab's account shape Christian moral teaching throughout the New Testament. The cautions against arrogance, the summons for sexual integrity, and the focus on faithfulness to God's agreement all find their origins in instruction learned through Israel's encounters with those descended from Lot. Themes and theology, pride, judgment, and unexpected grace. The threads interlace together, forming a pattern more intricate than any human craftsperson could construct. The account of Moab holds multiple levels of significance that reach far past the ascent and descent of an ancient nation. Their passage from Lot's cave to historical disappearance unveils configurations that address the most profound questions regarding human existence. Arrogance surfaces as the primary character deficiency that propels Moab's sorrowful narrative. From the start, they declined to recognize their modest beginnings. Rather than accepting their position as distant kin to Abraham's household, they determined to view themselves as peers who owed their cousins nothing. This arrogance showed itself in their refusal to permit passage to Israel during the years in the wilderness. A straightforward gesture of welcoming travelers could have altered everything. Rather, they determined to perceive Israel's requirement as a chance to display their own significance. The choice initiated a pattern of confrontation that would extend across centuries. The employment of Balaam exemplifies pride in its most refined expression. Instead of accepting God's blessing upon Israel, Moab attempted to control divine power through professional intermediaries. They maintained the belief that money could acquire supernatural interference. They placed confidence in human arrangements more than divine authority. When direct confrontation proved unsuccessful, pride modified its approach without relinquishing its objective. The seduction at Shittim demonstrated greater effectiveness than military strength or employed prophecy. Moab uncovered that corruption achieves results where confrontation produces failure. The instruction would reverberate through their subsequent encounters with Israel. Divine judgment surfaces throughout Moab's narrative, yet never as random punishment. Each outcome flows in natural progression from the decisions that came before. God's justice functions like moral attraction, pulling people toward the results their choices generate. The judgment commences subtly through exclusion from covenant assurances. Moab could have participated in Abraham's blessing to all nations. Rather, they positioned themselves beyond the current of divine mercy. Their rejection of Israel's God signified rejection of Israel's destiny. Military defeat suffered under David exemplifies increased repercussions for increased rebellion. Moab's persistent aggression, following the wilderness years, proved their unwillingness to gain wisdom from previous errors. David's measuring cord measured not simply captives, but the gathered weight of choices made as a nation. The prophetic declarations against Moab revealed judgment arriving at its most complete manifestation. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos all announced destruction upon a people who have drained divine forbearance. Nevertheless, even these severe pronouncements hold suggestions of ultimate restoration. Judgment functions more for correction than for revenge. The conquest by Babylon realizes the prophetic warnings with historical exactness. Nebuchadnezzar transforms into God's tool for carrying out sentence upon a nation that selected destruction in place of repentance. The surrender of Kir Hareseth designates the termination of Moab as a sovereign political entity. Nevertheless, grace weaves through the narrative like golden thread through dark cloth. The account of Ruth proves that personal decision can supersede national destiny. Her choice to follow Israel's God reshapes her from a representation of corruption into a foremother of monarchs. The placement of a Moabite woman in David's genealogy discloses divine intention working through human shortcoming. God's design advances, even when human participants rebel against their designated positions. The faithfulness of Ruth compensates for centuries of Moabite unfaithfulness. Grace additionally surfaces in the continuation of Moabite people despite their nation's destruction. While their governmental structure disintegrates, individuals and households persist in existing. The possibility remains available for future generations to make different selections than their forebears. The theological strain between judgment and compassion discovers its resolution in the character of God instead of the circumstances of history. Divine justice requires repercussions for moral decisions. However, divine love pursues restoration even for those in rebellion. Moab experiences both dimensions of God's nature. The configuration established within Moab's account repeats throughout Scripture with other nations and persons. Arrogance leads toward rebellion. Rebellion leads toward corruption. Corruption leads toward judgment, and judgment creates the possibility for grace. The pattern persists because human nature remains unchanged. Contemporary readers can recognize their own conflicts within Moab's passage. The temptation to rely on human understanding over divine disclosure surfaces in every generation. The impulse to control spiritual powers for personal advantage never vanishes. The arrogance that refuses to recognize dependence on God's mercy remains humanity's most fundamental difficulty. The account additionally discloses how complete cultures can drift from truth through minor compromises repeated across time. The corruption of Moab commenced with selections that appeared sensible within their immediate situation. Each generation received slightly more distorted principles than their parents had possessed. Nevertheless, personal responsibility continues even within corrupt arrangements. Ruth demonstrates that individual faithfulness remains achievable regardless of cultural surroundings. Her selection proves that no person is trapped permanently by their situations or ancestry. The primary message of Moab's account directs attention toward the requirement for divine interference in human matters. Neither political understanding nor religious observance can resolve the essential difficulty of human arrogance. Only grace, arriving from beyond the system, can shatter the pattern of rebellion and judgment. This theological structure prepares readers for the gospel message that appears in the New Testament. Christ accomplishes what human striving cannot achieve. He supplies the righteousness that law requires and presents the grace that love seeks. The account that commenced with Lot's shortcoming discovers its resolution in another's faithfulness. Legacy. Moab's position in the eternal account. The sites where archaeology occurs rest silent beneath the Jordanian sun. Tourists from time to time make visits to the ruins of ancient Kir Hareseth, their cameras recording stones that previously witnessed the sacrifice of children to Chemosh. Only a small number comprehend they stand on terrain that shaped the spiritual history of humanity. The physical presence of Moab disappeared from history more than 2,000 years in the past. No contemporary nation asserts descent from the people who previously employed Balaam and seduced Israel at Shittim. Their language vanished, along with their political sovereignty. Their traditions dissolved into the wider currents of regional civilization. Nevertheless, their impact reaches far beyond their historical duration. The configurations they created reverberate through scripture like musical motifs that repeat in different tonalities. Arrogance, rebellion, seduction, and judgment surface repeatedly within biblical accounts, each occurrence deepening our comprehension of the initial template. The narrative functions as a warning regarding the extended consequences of moral selections. Choices made within Lot's cave echo across centuries until they arrive at their ultimate realization in Babylon's conquest. No action stands in isolation. Every selection contributes to a broader narrative that stretches past individual lifespans. Contemporary psychology identifies comparable configurations in family arrangements and cultural traditions. Dysfunction transfers from one generation to another generation, unless deliberately interrupted. The account of Moab demonstrates this concept on a national magnitude, revealing how entire populations can receive destructive configurations from their ancestors. The theological implications penetrate even more deeply than the psychological ones. Moab proves that spiritual rebellion produces universal repercussions. Their resistance to God's intentions affected not simply their own fate, but the history of redemption itself. Their selections held significance on an eternal scale. The placement of Ruth within the messianic line supplies the most striking demonstration of divine authority working through human participation. The woman who selected Israel's God becomes incorporated into the genealogy that reaches to Christ. Her faithfulness reshapes centuries of Moabite resistance into a contribution toward redemption. This transformation discloses a fundamental biblical concept regarding God's capacity to write in straight lines using crooked instruments. Human shortcoming does not derail divine intention. Even rebellion can serve providential purposes when filtered through sovereign mercy. The resistance of Moab to Israel ultimately emphasizes the miraculous character of Israel's continuation. The prophetic writings employ Moab as a representation that surpasses their historical presence. When Isaiah and Jeremiah announce judgment on arrogance and rebellion, they reference Moab as the defining illustration of what such dispositions generate. The nation transforms into a theological idea that extends across cultures and centuries. Writers from early Christian periods perceived in Moab's account a preview of the church's conflict against worldly contamination. The seduction at Shittim corresponded to the continuous temptation for believers to make compromises with beliefs outside their faith. The cautions against Moabite sway became guiding concepts for preserving spiritual integrity. Commentators from medieval Jewish tradition discovered in Ruth's transformation a pattern for authentic conversion to Judaism. Her complete identification with Israel's people and God set the benchmark for individuals who selected to become part of the covenant community. The negative illustration of Moab generated positive guiding concepts. Theologians from the Reformation employed Moab's account to demonstrate the teaching of complete moral incapacity. Despite their benefits as relatives of Abraham, they selected rebellion instead of righteousness. Their shortcoming proved that human nature requires divine grace for rescue. Natural devotion leads toward Chemosh, not toward the authentic God. Contemporary missions endeavors discover in Moab's account both caution and optimism. The caution addresses the peril of cultural adjustment that sacrifices essential truth. The optimism resides in illustrations like Ruth, who demonstrate that no population group exists beyond the reach of divine mercy. Discoveries through archaeology persist in bringing clarity to dimensions of Moabite civilization that enhance biblical comprehension. The Mesha Stele supplies Moabite viewpoint on their confrontations with Israel. Fragments of pottery disclose particulars regarding daily existence. Foundations of platforms verify the actuality of Chemosh veneration. These physical remnants link contemporary readers to ancient actualities in concrete ways. The stones provide testimony regarding human selections and their repercussions. History transforms into something personal when examined through archaeological proof that endured across centuries. Israel in the present day incorporates territory that previously belonged to Moab. Jewish communities now inhabit elevated locations where Chemosh received sacrifices. The territory that observed child sacrifice at this time raises children who examine Torah. Geography narrates its own account regarding redemption and transformation. The Dead Sea Scrolls, uncovered in caves along Moab's ancient boundary, hold fragments that reference their account. These manuscripts, concealed for centuries, surfaced just as the contemporary state of Israel experienced rebirth. The sequence appears providential, as though ancient witnesses awakened to provide testimony regarding eternal concepts. Academic biblical investigation persists in examining particulars regarding Moabite chronology, civilization, and belief system. Fresh discoveries sharpen our comprehension while validating the fundamental precision of biblical accounts. Scholarship serves the broader intention of comprehending God's methods with humanity. The significance of the account ultimately resides not in historical interest, but in spiritual instruction. Every generation confronts the identical fundamental selections that faced Moab. Will we rely on human understanding or divine disclosure? Will we chase arrogance or embrace humility? Will we select corruption or covenant faithfulness? The responses Moab provided to these questions formed their fate and influenced the trajectory of redemption history. Their selections hold significance not because they were exceptional, but because they were representative. Human nature persists unchanged across cultures and centuries. The legacy stretches into eternity through the genealogy that links Ruth to Christ. The faithfulness of the Moabite woman contributes in direct manner to the incarnation of God's Son. Her account demonstrates that no background renders anyone unqualified from participating in divine intentions. This eternal viewpoint reshapes how we interpret Moab's complete narrative. Their resistance to Israel was actual and harmful. Their sway corrupted God's people on multiple occasions. Their arrogance resulted in national destruction. Nevertheless, even their shortcoming serves the broader account of redemption that reaches its peak in Christ. The concluding declaration regarding Moab belongs not to judgment but rather to grace. The people who commenced in a cave marked by disgrace contributed to the royal lineage that generated humanity's rescuer. Their account concludes not in Babylon's conquest, but rather in Bethlehem's place of birth. Mortality yields to vitality. Curse transforms into blessing. The final becomes foremost in the system of divine love.